A man kneels before a dragon, not because someone forced him to, because he chose to. Because before Skyrim had a name, dragons were not monsters. They were rulers, and the people who served them built the first secret organization this land ever had. Tonight, we go back to where it all started. Not to the guilds, you know, but to the one that came before all of them, buried in cold stone, watching from the dark, keeping things that most of Skyrim has completely forgotten. Welcome, get comfortable, let your eyes close if they want to. Tonight we are going back further than most players ever go. Back to the very first age of this world, back to the dragon cult, and the things they kept even from each other. Before any human kingdom stood in Skyrim, the dragons ruled these lands openly. They did not hide, they did not sleep, they flew, they commanded, and when one of them spoke, the ground moved with the sound. The ancient Nords did not fight them at first. They followed them. A group of devoted servants rose around the dragons. Men and women who believed that serving a dragon was the highest purpose a mortal could reach. These were the dragon priests. Most players know the name. Most have fought one in a dark ruin and taken their mask. But these figures were not simply powerful enemies waiting in dungeons. Back then, they were the most organized group in all of Skyrim, with ranks, rituals, and a structure built to outlast even the dragons themselves. The part of the cult that ordinary people saw was large. Common priests served in temples, led ceremonies, and managed the communities that formed around dragon worship. They wore robes, they taught, they organized the labor that raised the great stone structures, still standing across Skyrim today. But above them sat a much smaller and much quieter group, one that common priests were never told about. Scholars studying dragon cult ruins have found signs of a rank that sat above dragon priest. These figures left almost no records. Their names do not appear in public cult documents. They are mentioned only in the most deeply buried chambers of cult sites, carved into walls that were clearly never meant for outside eyes. The masks worn by dragon priests were not decorations. Each one had a purpose tied to that priest's specific role. The design told other cult members what that priest controlled, which region, which dragon, which kind of authority. But something else happened when a priest wore one for long enough. The mask changed them. Not quickly, not in any way easy to notice, but over years of continuous use, it became part of the person wearing it. The cult believed this was a gift, that the mask let the priest carry more power than a normal human body could hold on its own. The cost was that the priests slowly stopped being entirely human. Their connection to ordinary life faded, their attention narrowed to their dragon and their duties. By the time a dragon priest reached the height of their power, very little remained in them that remembered what it felt like to simply be a person. This helps explain why so many of them held their form long after death. The mask kept something in place. The bond that tied them to their dragon did not simply break when the body gave out. It kept holding. The cold stone of their tombs became a kind of suspended state. Not death, not life, but something in between. Some fans believe this was intentional, that the burial rites were designed so that if the dragons ever called again, their servants would still be there, still wearing their masks, still bound by an oath made in an age the world has mostly stopped thinking about. Deep in the oldest dragon cult ruins, there are rooms that have nothing to do with worship. No altars, no dragon carvings, no ceremonial arrangements, just bare stone chambers covered in a different kind of marking. Symbols researchers have connected to record keeping rather than ritual. The cult kept records, not the kind a library keeps. These were records of secrets, pieces of knowledge considered too important to speak aloud and too sensitive to write in any script that outsiders might one day learn. They developed their own writing system, used only within the most restricted circles, for information that could not be allowed to leave the organization. What did they record? Based on the few fragments scholars have worked through, the records covered 3 areas. First, the specific weaknesses of each dragon they served, kept in case a priest ever needed to manage an unstable dragon lord. Second, the locations of hidden supply caches spread across Skyrim in places chosen to be overlooked. Third, what individual dragons had said in private. Dragons told their priests things they did not say publicly. The cult wrote those words down. They kept them sealed. This suggests that even the bond between dragons and their servants was not purely one of devotion. The priests were also, quietly, keeping track. Not every member served willingly. This detail gets lost when people think of the cult as a unified religious movement. In the communities that formed around dragon-controlled lands, joining was not always a choice. Young people with strong voices, those who showed early signs of the vocal qualities dragons valued, were identified and brought into service. Their families were not asked. The cult called it an honor. The families understood it as something else. These people formed the lower working ranks. They maintained temples, prepared ritual materials, and carried out the physical work of keeping the organization running. They were never told about the upper structure. They served the visible layer and nothing more. Some players have connected this to a broader pattern in how the cult operated. It was not simply a religion. It was a system of control. The dragons held their power not just through strength, but through an organization that touched every part of daily life back then. The priests managed food, shelter, and community order. To leave the cult's reach meant leaving the community entirely. The cult had learned something that later organizations in Skyrim would also figure out. That the most lasting kind of control does not look like control at all. It looks like community. It looks like purpose. It looks like somewhere you belong. The cult's collapse was slow. The ancient Nordic heroes, Hakon One-Eye, Gormlaith Golden Hilt, and Feldir the Old, eventually found a way to challenge the dragons using the power of the voice. When Alduin fell and the dragons pulled back from the sky, the cult lost the foundation of everything that had given it authority. Without the dragons present, the priests held no power that anyone was willing to accept. Communities that had organized themselves around dragon worship began to come apart. Lower ranks scattered. Many simply walked away, but the upper levels did not walk away. Those figures whose names appear only in the deepest sealed chambers had built their entire existence around preserving what the cult had gathered. They went further underground. They sealed their most important locations. They placed their records and most significant objects in chambers, built to survive without any maintenance. And then, one by one, they sealed the doors behind themselves as well. Not out of grief, not out of desperation, out of a calculated choice. The knowledge they held was worth more than whatever years they had left. They became permanent guardians of what the cult had built, not of warmth or light, but of everything the world above had decided to move past. The ruins you walk through in Skyrim are not simply old buildings. Many of them are what remains of the most organized institution those early centuries ever produced. The cult built with clear purpose. Their structures were not just places of worship. They were designed for storage, communication, hierarchy, and secrecy all at once. Long after the dragons stopped flying and the priests stopped breathing, the buildings held. Later civilizations built around them, on top of them, or left them alone in the cold. The Companions, the College of Winterhold, the Thieves Guild, none of them came first. Something older came before all of them. It kept its deepest work hidden from its own members. It recorded what was never meant to be recorded, and some of those sealed rooms have sat untouched since long before the First Era began. The dragon cult's deepest secret may be the simplest one. It never fully ended, it only went quiet, and in Skyrim, the things that go quiet tend to last far longer than anyone expects. The Companions did not start in a mead hall. They did not start in Whiterun. They did not even start in Skyrim. They started on a dying continent far to the north, in the cold dark, around a man who had just lost everything. What bound them together was not a charter, not a building, not a name. It was a single spoken oath, made before they ever set foot on the land they were about to take back by force. Atmora was already failing when Isgramor led his people away from it. The continent that had been home to the ancient Nords for generations was growing colder, darker, and harder to live in with each passing year. Crops would not grow. The winters stretched longer. Communities that had survived for centuries began to break apart. Ysgramor was not simply a warrior looking for conquest. He was a leader watching his homeland slowly stop being livable. The crossing to Skyrim was not an adventure, it was survival. He brought his family first. His sons came with him. A small group of followers made the voyage across the cold sea and settled at a place they called Sarthol, the first human city in Skyrim. For a time, things worked. The land was hard, but it held food. The settlement grew. Then the snow elves attacked in the night. They burned Sarthol. They killed nearly everyone inside it. Ysgramor lost his sons. He lost his community. He escaped with almost nothing and made the long journey back to Atmora, carrying that loss with him. What happened next is where the companions truly begin. Back in Atmora, Ysgramor did not grieve quietly. He gathered people. He told them what had been taken, and he made a case for going back. 500 answered him. Not soldiers, not a trained army, ordinary people. Hunters, craftsmen, farmers, who chose to cross a cold and dangerous sea because one man stood in front of them and spoke plainly about what had been lost and what needed to be done about it. The oath they swore before leaving was not a formal document. It was a spoken agreement made between people who understood they might not come back. They swore to stand together until the work was finished. That oath, spoken on Atmoran soil before the ships were loaded, was the true founding of the Companions. Wuthrad is remembered as Ysgramor's axe. Most players who encounter it in the game understand it as a powerful weapon with a history tied to the ancient Nords, but its role within the original 500 went beyond anything a weapon normally does. The axe was present when the oath was spoken. It was held by Ysgramor during the swearing. This made it, in the understanding of the people who followed him, a physical object that the oath lived inside. Not symbolically, literally, in the way that ancient Nords understood oaths to work. For the Atmorans, a spoken vow needed a witness. That witness could be a person, it could be a god, or it could be an object present at the moment the words were said. Wuthrad witnessed the oath of the 500. That made it more than a weapon from that moment forward. It became the physical record of what those people had promised each other. Carrying it into battle was not about the damage it could do. It was about bringing the oath itself into the fight. When Ysgramor raised Wuthrad, every person who had stood on that shore in Atmora understood what they were seeing. The promise was still alive. The work was not yet finished. This is part of why its destruction mattered so much later. When Wuthrad was shattered into fragments and scattered, it was not simply a famous weapon being broken. According to the way the original Companions understood it, the oath that lived inside it was being broken apart as well. The Companions who came after, the ones who gathered those fragments across generations and eventually restored the axe, were not just completing an archaeological project, they were reassembling the original promise, putting the oath back together piece by piece. The campaign to retake Skyrim from the Snow Elves was long and costly. The 500 did not stay 500. People died throughout the fighting, in battles, in ambushes, in the cold between settlements. The Companions developed burial practices during this period that were specific to their group and were kept separate from general Nordic burial tradition. A companion who fell in the field did not receive the same rights as an ordinary person who died in a village. The specific details of these rights were not written down during the campaign. They were passed between surviving members and performed consistently enough that later generations inherited them without always knowing where they had come from. What scholars have pieced together from Nordic ruins and fragmentary records suggests the rites included 3 elements: First, the fallen companions' weapons were not buried with them. They were kept by the group and carried forward. A dead companion's blade stayed in the fight. Second, a portion of the burial ceremony was conducted in silence. No words were spoken during a specific part of the ritual. The silence was deliberate and considered essential. Third, the site of burial was marked with a specific pattern carved into nearby stone. Not a name, not a date. Just a pattern that members of the group would recognize and outsiders would not. These rites created something practical and something deeper at the same time. Practically, they gave a traveling warband a way to honor their dead without stopping for long. The silence kept the ceremony short. The weapons kept moving. The unmarked stone kept the grave from being disturbed by enemies. But deeper than that, the rites reinforced the idea that the companions were a group whose membership did not simply end at death. A fallen member's weapons were still part of the group. Their burial site was marked in a language only the group could read. They remained present in a specific way even after they were gone. When the campaign ended and the snow elves had been driven from the surface of Skyrim, the 500, or what remained of them, faced a question that no one had thought much about during the fighting. What did they do now? The oath had been about a specific task. That task was done. The natural thing would have been to scatter, return to whatever lives they could build. But a group that has spent years together, sleeping in the cold and watching each other die, does not simply scatter easily. A smaller group within the surviving companions chose to stay together. They made a second oath, quieter than the first, spoken among themselves without ceremony. This vow covered two things. First, they agreed to remain as a group and continue operating as a unit, even without a war to fight. Second, and this is the part that most later members of the companions never knew, they agreed to keep certain things about the campaign silent. Specific events that had happened during the retaking of Skyrim were not to be spoken of outside the group. Not because those events were shameful, but because the surviving members understood that some of what had happened in those years was the kind of thing that, spoken aloud to outsiders, would change how the group was understood. They wanted the companions to be known for what they had accomplished, not for the full weight of everything it had cost. This vow of silence was not written down either. It was maintained through culture, through an unspoken understanding, passed between senior and junior members over generations. By the time the companions had been established in Whiterun for centuries, most members had no idea the vow existed, but certain behaviors persisted in the organization that can only be explained by it. The companions have always been notably quiet about their own history. They do not keep detailed records. They do not celebrate specific events from their founding period. Senior members have historically discouraged questions about Ysgramor's campaign beyond its broad outlines. The silence that was sworn on the shores of Skyrim long ago never fully lifted. It just became part of how the companions operated. So normal that no one thought to ask where it came from. Jorvaskr sits in Whiterun, on a rise above the rest of the city. It is the oldest building in Whiterun, older than the walls, older than the roads, older than almost any other structure still standing in that hold. The companions did not build it. They found it. Or more precisely, they found the site already held meaning before they arrived, and they built around what was there. The hall itself was constructed from the hull of one of the ships that carried the 500 across the sea. This is confirmed in Nordic lore. The companions deliberately used the physical material of their crossing as the structure of their home. The ship that had carried them from Atmora became the roof over their heads in Skyrim. This was not practical. It was intentional. The crossing was part of the founding. The ship was part of the oath. Building their hall from it kept that connection physical and present in a way that words alone could not. But beneath Jorvaskr, and beneath the rise it sits on, something older exists. The companions built on that specific location because the ground there already carried significance to the people who had lived in Skyrim before them. Some fans believe the rise was a site used for Nordic ritual during the earliest period of human settlement, possibly even connected to voice practices that predate the formalization of the way of the voice. Others point to the companion's own Skyforge as evidence. The Skyforge sits adjacent to Jorvaska and is described in the game as being ancient beyond measure, older than the companions, older than Whiterun, older than any structure around it. An object that old, sitting on ground that the companions chose specifically for their home, suggests that the choice of location was not random. They built where they built because the ground already meant something. Because something in that place had been considered worth protecting. Long before Isgrimor's ships touched the shore, the 500 became a guild slowly, and without any formal decision to do so. There was no meeting where they decided to stop being a warband and start being an institution. It happened through time and through the decisions of the people who stayed. New members joined, old members aged and passed their knowledge on. The oath of the founders became the culture of the organization. The silence became tradition. The burial rites became ceremony. What the companions carried forward from that original crossing was not a set of rules. It was a way of being together that had been shaped by years of loss and cold and shared purpose. They had crossed a sea. They had fought through a continent. They had buried people they loved in unmarked ground and kept moving. By the time they built their hall from the hull of their ship and settled on that old rise in Whiterun, they were not founding a guild. They were finding a place to rest, carrying everything the crossing had made them, and everything the war had cost, and everything the oath had promised. The guild that exists in Skyrim today is what that crossing became across thousands of years of time. Most of what the 500 knew and swore and kept silent about has been lost, but the hall built from their ship is still standing. The axe is still carried, and the Skyforge still burns on the old ground, as it has since long before anyone thought to give it a name. Most people think the College of Winterhold was the beginning of organized magic in Skyrim. It was not. Long before that building stood on its cliff above the sea, small groups of mages were already operating across Skyrim in hidden towers, with no names and no official standing. They kept no public records. They answered to no authority. And they understood something about knowledge that later institutions forgot. That the most dangerous thing you can do with power is let everyone know you have it. The First Era brought human kingdoms to Skyrim for the first time. Cities grew. Roads connected settlements. Trade moved goods from hold to hold. And in the quieter corners of all this activity, in the northern reaches especially, where the population was thin and the winters were long, small groups of mages began to gather around individuals who had found ways to work with magicka that most people around them could not explain or replicate. These were not schools. They had no formal structure, no curriculum, no graduating members. They were circles, a loose word for a group of people who had found each other and chosen to stay close because what they knew was safer shared than held alone. A circle might be 3 people, it might be 12. The size depended on how much the central figure trusted others and how much the surrounding land could quietly support without drawing attention. They built in places that were easy to miss. A tower on a ridge that looked abandoned from the road below. A structure built into the base of a cliff face where the stone already created natural cover. A building placed on ground that travelers avoided for reasons they could not explain. Reasons the mages had carefully arranged in advance. These tower libraries were the first organized repositories of magical knowledge in Skyrim. They held written records of spells, observations about magicka behavior in northern climates, notes on how different materials responded to enchantment, and personal records kept by individual mages about what they had tried, what had worked, and what had gone badly. The collections were small by later standards, but they were carefully maintained. A circle that lost its library, lost its memory. Members understood this and protected their records accordingly. The discomfort was always the first sign. A traveler approaching one of these towers without invitation would begin to feel uneasy well before reaching the door. Not frightened exactly, not in pain, just wrong. A low sense that the direction they were walking was a mistake, that something ahead was not meant for them, that turning back would feel better than going forward. Most travelers listened to that feeling and changed course without understanding why. This was not an accident. The mages who built these towers had developed a specific application of enchantment that worked not on objects, but on space itself. They called it different things in different circles. The records that survive use several terms, but the effect was consistent. By working certain enchantments into the ground around a structure, into the stone of the walls, and into the air at specific distances from the entrance, a skilled mage could create an invisible boundary that non-mages found deeply uncomfortable to cross. The enchantment did not harm anyone. It produced no visible effect. It simply made the space feel hostile to people who did not carry magicka in the way trained practitioners did. The elegance of this approach was that it left no evidence. A ward that throws lightning at intruders announces itself. An enchanted boundary that makes people feel mildly uneasy produces no bodies, no complaints, and no reason for anyone in authority to investigate. The towers sat behind their invisible boundaries for generations. Local communities developed reputations for the areas around them. Places where animals behaved strangely, where travelers got turned around, where the air felt heavy at certain times of day. These reputations served the mages perfectly. The communities avoided the areas. The circles worked undisturbed. The knowledge inside the towers grew quietly for decades at a time, without interference. Among the objects these early circles produced, a specific category of spell tome stands apart from ordinary magical texts. Standard spell tomes in Elder Scrolls lore transfer knowledge directly to the reader. A person opens the book, the knowledge passes into them, and the book becomes inert. These early Nordic tomes worked differently. A small number of them were created with a secondary function built in alongside the primary spell instruction. As the reader absorbed the spell, the tome absorbed something back. Not the spell, not the knowledge. Something smaller and harder to define. A fragment of the reader's memory connected to the moment of reading. The effect was not immediately noticeable. A mage who read one of these tomes would learn the spell perfectly. They would feel no different afterward. But over time, practitioners who used these tomes extensively reported a specific kind of gap in their recollection. Not forgetting, not confusion, more like a clean removal, a moment that had existed and then did not. Other members of their circle who had witnessed those moments would remember them. The mage themselves would not. The tome held the missing piece. Why were these tomes made this way? The honest answer is that scholars are not certain. Some fans believe the memory absorption was a flaw, an unintended consequence of the enchantment method used by early Nordic mage artificers who did not fully understand what they were building into, the objects. Others believe it was deliberate, that certain circles wanted insurance. A tome that holds a piece of its reader is a tome that maintains a connection to everyone who has ever used it. The circle that held the tomes held, in a very specific sense, a piece of everyone who had ever learned from them, whether that was a protective measure, a form of leverage, or simply an experiment that no one thought to stop, is a question the surviving records do not answer. Every circle had a protocol for the moment things went wrong, not if, when. The mages who operated in Skyrim during those early centuries understood that their position was permanently fragile. A new Jarl who distrusted magic, a religious movement that decided mages were a threat, a rival circle that decided cooperation was less useful than elimination. Any of these could arrive without much warning. The circles planned accordingly. The destruction of records was practiced and deliberate, not panicked burning at the last moment. That approach lost too much and left too much evidence. What the organized circles developed was a tiered system. Records were divided into categories based on how dangerous they would be in hostile hands. The least sensitive material was kept accessible. The most sensitive material was stored in a form that could be rapidly and completely destroyed without fire, without noise, and without leaving readable remains. The specific methods varied by circle. Some used enchanted containers that dissolved their contents when opened incorrectly. Some maintained certain records only in memory, held by a designated keeper who was the only person who knew specific pieces of information, so that destroying the record meant only that one person needed to leave the area. Some circles maintained a second, false library, a collection of real-looking but entirely useless records designed to satisfy an investigator, while the actual library remained hidden elsewhere in the structure. When a circle genuinely felt its end approaching, the senior members made a final set of decisions about what would survive and what would not. The most valuable and most dangerous knowledge was either committed fully to memory by whoever was leaving, destroyed completely, or hidden so thoroughly that recovery would require knowing exactly where to look. Some of what those early circles hid has never been found. The towers fell apart. The locations were forgotten. But the things placed inside the deepest storage spaces of those structures were built to last without maintenance, sealed in materials chosen specifically because they do not decay easily. Somewhere in Skyrim's northern landscape, in places that feel slightly wrong to approach for reasons no one living can explain, some of that hidden material is still there. The College of Winterhold sits on a cliff at the northeastern edge of Skyrim. The cliff is eroding. A significant portion of the original city of Winterhold fell into the sea during an event called the Great Collapse, which occurred at the start of the Fourth Era. The college survived. This survival is sometimes attributed to the magical protections on the building, but some fans believe the reason the college survived while everything around it collapsed has less to do with the building itself and more to do with what sits beneath it. The cliff the college stands on is not ordinary ground. Practitioners who have spent extended time at the college report that magicka behaves differently there than anywhere else in Skyrim. Spells that require precise control are easier to manage inside the college walls. Certain types of magical research that produce unstable results elsewhere stabilize on college grounds in ways that the faculty has noted, but never fully explained. The assumption within the institution is that centuries of magical activity have saturated the location, that the ground has absorbed so much residual magicka over so many generations that it now amplifies and stabilizes the work done above it. This explanation is reasonable, but it assumes the saturation started when the college was built. Some players and lore scholars believe it started much earlier, that the cliff was chosen by the college's founders, not because it was a defensible and isolated location, though it is both, but because the ground there was already different, already pulling, already drawing magicka toward it from the surrounding landscape, in a way that sensitive practitioners could feel before they ever set foot on the site. If the early Nordic mage circles identified and used locations with natural magicka concentration, then the cliff at Winterhold would have been known to them long before any formal institution claimed it. The college may not have created what exists beneath it. It may simply have been built on top of something that was already there, drawn to the same ground for the same reason the circles had been drawn to it centuries before, following a pull that neither group fully understood and neither group stopped to fully question. The circles of the First Era left almost nothing behind that carries their name. No founding documents, no lists of members, no official histories written by anyone who wanted credit for what they had built. This was not an accident of time. It was a choice made repeatedly by people who understood that being known was a form of vulnerability they could not afford. What they left behind instead was the shape of what came after them. The College of Winterhold's founding principles: secrecy around certain research, the idea that some knowledge is held rather than shared, the practice of maintaining records that outside authorities are not shown. All of these trace back to habits that the early circles had developed and passed forward through the mages who eventually joined larger institutions. The founders of the college did not invent those habits. They inherited them from people whose names they may not have even known. The circles were already gone by then. Their towers had fallen or been abandoned. Their libraries had been hidden or destroyed. But the way of thinking that the circles had developed, the instinct to protect knowledge by controlling who could reach it, to build walls that felt wrong rather than walls that looked strong, to plan for an ending before the ending arrived. That way of thinking had already passed into the people who built what came next. The towers kept quiet, and the quiet, in the end, outlasted the towers themselves. Empires rise, kingdoms fall, languages die, and new ones grow in their place. None of this touches Hircine. While every civilization in Tamriel's long history was busy building or burning, the hunting grounds stayed exactly as they were: endless, cold, and patient. The prince who rules them does not watch history. He simply waits for it to send him more souls. Hircine is one of the 17 Daedric princes, beings that exist outside the mortal world and outside mortal time. Each prince embodies a concept. Hircine's concept is the hunt, not hunting as a practical activity, not the gathering of food or the management of animal populations. The hunt as something deeper and older. The relationship between predator and prey, the moment of pursuit, the gap between the living and the dying that the chase creates. That relationship is what Hircine is made of. It is what his realm reflects, and it is what every deal he has ever made with mortals has ultimately been about. The hunting grounds are described in Elder Scrolls lore as a vast wilderness, forests without edges, plains that stretch past any horizon a mortal eye could find, weather that changes without pattern, snow one moment, heat the next, fog that appears and dissolves without reason. Prey animals move through this landscape in numbers that never thin. They run, they hide, they exhaust themselves against a terrain that shifts just enough to keep the chase going. And the souls who hunt them never tire, never age, and never finish. The pursuit is the point. Hircine did not build a realm for his followers to rest in. He built one for them to keep moving through, forever. Souls end up in the hunting grounds through two main paths. The first is devotion, a mortal who worshipped Hircine faithfully during their life, who lived as a hunter and died as one, and who Hircine chooses to claim. The second is condition, a soul that carries the beast blood at the time of death. Werewolves, werebears, and other beast-blooded mortals do not automatically go to whatever afterlife their faith or their deeds might otherwise have directed them toward. Hircine has a prior claim. The beast blood is his mark. A soul wearing his mark goes to his realm. This is not presented as a punishment in his lore. It is presented as ownership. The companions acquired the beast blood through a deal. This much is confirmed in the game. What is less often examined carefully is what the deal actually contained, and what the companions understood about it at the time, versus what they chose not to examine too closely. The arrangement was made with a group called the Glenmoral Witches, a coven that has served as intermediaries between Hircine and mortals for a very long time. The companions approached them, not the other way around. The companions wanted something the witches could provide, and the witches had a price that the companions accepted. The surface of that agreement was straightforward. The companions received the beast blood. Their members gained strength, speed, and the ability to transform. In exchange, their souls, upon death, would go to Hircine's realm rather than wherever they would otherwise have gone. But the thing worth sitting with is the second layer. The companions who made this deal were warriors. They were practical people who understood exchange. They knew what they were agreeing to. What some fans believe they did not fully account for, or chose not to, was that the deal did not only apply to them, it applied to everyone who received the beast blood from them afterward, every member they brought into the inner circle, every person they passed the gift to across the generations that followed. Those people made no deal with anyone. They received the blood as part of joining a group they trusted. The agreement made by the founding circle reached forward through time and attached itself to people who had no voice in its terms. Hircine's arrangement with the companions is, in this reading, one of the more quietly far-reaching deals in Skyrim's history. A small group of people made a choice that bound an unknown number of future souls to a Daedric realm they may never have chosen on their own. The companions' leadership has understood this for a long time. The evidence is in how carefully they have always controlled who receives the beast blood, and how little they have historically said about what receiving it actually means for what happens after death. Hircine does not give anything without a second price attached. This pattern holds across every interaction he has with mortals recorded in Elder Scrolls lore. The gift is real, the benefit is genuine, but underneath the gift, always, is something the recipient did not ask about and was not told directly. With the beast blood, the visible gift is power, transformation, speed and strength beyond normal human limits. The hidden cost operates on two levels. The first is the soul claim already discussed, the redirection of the soul after death to Hircine's realm. The second is subtler and operates during life rather than after it. Beast blood changes the person who carries it, not just physically during transformation. It changes how they think about certain things. Hunger becomes sharper. The instinct toward pursuit, toward chasing, toward the resolution of a hunt, becomes part of how the mind works, even in human form. Most carriers manage this without dramatic difficulty, but it is a change. It is a permanent alteration to the inner life of the person, installed without their specific consent, as part of a package they received when they joined a group that had made a deal generations before they were born. Some fans believe this mental shift is also intentional on Hircine's part, that a mind shaped by the hunt is a mind already partway into his realm, that by the time a beast-blooded mortal dies and their soul passes to the hunting grounds, they are not arriving somewhere entirely foreign. They are arriving somewhere their mind has been moving toward for years. The realm feels right to them. The pursuit feels natural. The forever chase is not a punishment they resist. It is an extension of something the blood already taught them to want. The gift in this reading was always the preparation. The hunting grounds were always the destination. Hircine simply took the long way around to get each soul where he intended it to go. Every werewolf in Skyrim carries Hircine's mark. This includes people who received the beast blood with full knowledge of what it meant. It also includes people who were transformed against their will, attacked and infected by another werewolf without choosing it. It includes people who had no knowledge of Hircine at all, who had never worshipped him, never sought his favor, and never made any agreement with anyone connected to him. The beast blood does not ask. It does not check whether the person receiving it consented to the spiritual conditions attached. It simply spreads, and the mark spreads with it. This creates a situation that sits quietly in the background of Skyrim's world, without ever being fully addressed in the main game. There are werewolves in Skyrim who do not know what they are, or who know what they are, but do not know what it means for their soul after death. They follow their own faiths. They pray to the divines or to other Daedric princes. They expect their afterlife to follow from those beliefs. Hircine's claim on them operates regardless. This is one of the more uncomfortable details in his lore. Not because he is presented as villainous for it, but because it illustrates something about how Daedric claims work. They are not personal agreements between a prince and a specific mortal. They are conditions attached to things that move through the mortal world on their own. The beast blood is a carrier for a claim that Hircine does not need to enforce actively. It enforces itself quietly every time it passes from one person to another. He does not need to be involved. The arrangement he made with the Glenmoral witches long ago is still running, still spreading, still collecting, without him needing to think about it at all. The leadership of the companions, specifically the inner circle known as the Circle, has always known more about the beast blood than the wider membership. This is confirmed in the game. What is worth looking at carefully is the specific shape of what they know and what they have historically chosen not to pass forward. Kodlak Whitemane, the harbinger of the companions in Skyrim's fourth era, knew the full terms of the original arrangement. He knew what the beast blood meant for souls after death. He had spent years researching whether the claim could be broken. He had not told the full circle everything he knew. He had not told newer members anything close to the full picture. This was not unique to Kodlak. The pattern of the companions' leadership holding back specific knowledge about the beast blood goes back much further than him. It is embedded in how the organization has operated for generations. Why? The simple answer is protection. That telling members the full spiritual cost of the beast blood might cause them to refuse it or leave the circle. But some fans believe the reason runs deeper than recruitment concerns. The companions' leadership may have maintained the silence, not to deceive their members, but because they had no solution to offer alongside the truth. Knowing about Hircine's claim without any way to break it is simply a weight to carry. Passing that weight to every member who joins the inner circle means every circle member spends their years of service carrying something heavy with no resolution available to them. Kodlak's generation was the first in a long time to actively work toward a solution, rather than simply maintaining the silence. The cure he sought, the one the player eventually helps complete, was not a new idea. It was the first time in generations that someone in the companions decided that the truth, even without a solution, was better than the quiet. Hircine does not appear in Skyrim's main story as an active presence. He is felt more than seen. In the beast blood moving through the companions, in the hunting grounds waiting at the edge of every werewolf's death, in the deal that a group of warriors made long ago and that has been running ever since without needing anyone to renew it. This is how he operates. Not through dramatic intervention, not through commands delivered to devoted followers, through arrangements that sustain themselves, through marks that spread on their own, through gifts that come with second prices that take years or lifetimes to fully arrive. The hunting grounds are always there, always the same. The prey always runs. The hunters always follow. And somewhere in that endless landscape, souls who never asked to be there are doing what the blood already taught them to do. Moving forward, always forward, through a realm that was ready for them long before they arrived. When the war ended, most people went home. The snow elves had been driven underground. Skyrim was open. The 500 had done what they crossed the sea to do. But a small group of Isgrimmor's closest warriors did not go home. They stayed together. They kept meeting. They kept certain things between themselves. And what they built in that quiet period, after the fighting stopped and before anyone was watching closely, became the hidden foundation that every version of the companions since has unknowingly stood on. The 500 companions were never a flat organization. Even during the campaign, certain individuals operated closer to Isgrimmor than others. These were not necessarily the strongest fighters or the most decorated warriors. They were the ones Ysgrimmor trusted with decisions that affected the whole group. Supply movements, negotiation with local populations, the handling of situations that required judgment rather than just force. By the time the campaign ended, this group of perhaps 20 to 30 people had spent years making choices together that the rest of the 500 never knew about in full detail. After the fighting ended, this group faced a specific problem. They held a great deal of information that had been useful during the war, and that was now simply heavy. decisions made in difficult circumstances, actions taken that had achieved necessary results, but that did not reflect well on anyone involved. The kind of knowledge that, in peacetime, becomes a liability rather than an asset. The wider membership of the companions did not have this knowledge. Isgrimor's inner group did, and they needed to decide what to do with it. The decision they reached was not to destroy it, and not to share it. They chose a third path, to hold it within the group, structured and controlled, accessible only to those who had been part of the decisions in the first place, and to selected successors who would be brought into the inner circle deliberately and carefully over time. This required a formal arrangement between the members of the group, an agreement about who held what, who could pass it on, and under what conditions. What they built in the years immediately following the end of the campaign was the first version of what the companions would eventually call the Circle, an inner group within the larger organization that held knowledge and authority the wider membership was not given access to. The oath this group swore was different from the one made before crossing the sea. That earlier promise had been outward-facing, a commitment to a shared mission spoken in front of everyone who was going on the voyage. This new oath was inward-facing. It was spoken quietly, among the members of the inner group only, and it covered two distinct areas. The first area was silence around specific events. Certain things that had happened during the retaking of Skyrim were named in the oath, not described in any record, just referenced, and sworn never to be spoken of outside the group. The members who swore this were the only people alive who knew the full details of those events. The oath ensured that the knowledge would not spread further than it already had. What those events were is not recorded anywhere that scholars have been able to find. The oath covered them too thoroughly. What remains is the shape of the silence, the evidence that something was being kept, without any surviving record of what it was. The second area was succession. The inner group agreed on a method for bringing new members into their circle over time. Not every senior companion would be eligible. Not every strong or loyal member would be considered. The selection was based on judgment, on whether the person being considered could be trusted with the specific weight of what the group held, and on whether they had the temperament to carry that weight without it, changing how they operated publicly. The criteria were never written down. They were assessed informally by the existing members of the inner group, and passed forward as instinct and observation, rather than as a formal checklist. This made the succession process both highly selective and deeply resistant to documentation. Two qualities that appear to have been intentional. High-ranking members of this inner circle were buried differently from ordinary companions. The distinction was not visible from outside. The burial mounds of senior and junior companions looked similar to outsiders. Stone-built, Nordic in design, marked with the recognizable symbols of the companions' tradition. The difference was in what happened inside, and in the specific rites performed during the burial process itself. For ordinary companions, burial involved the standard Nordic practices of the period: weapons placed with the body, honors spoken aloud, a ceremony that the wider membership could attend and participate in. For members of the inner circle, the burial included an additional set of rites performed only by other inner circle members. After the wider ceremony had concluded and the general membership had left, these rites were conducted in silence. No words were spoken. The actions performed were physical rather than verbal. Specific arrangements made to the burial chamber. Specific objects placed in positions that carried meaning to those who understood the system and looked like ordinary burial custom to those who did not. Over generations, these additional rites were gradually abandoned. The reasons are not entirely clear. Some scholars who have studied companion burial sites believe the rites became impossible to maintain properly, as the original inter-circle members died, and the specific knowledge of what each element meant passed out of living memory. Others believe the abandonment was deliberate, that at some point the inner circle decided the rites were drawing attention they did not want, and quietly stopped performing them. Either way, by the time the companions had been established in Whiterun for several centuries, the specific burial practices of the original inner circle had been erased from active tradition. They survived only as faint traces in the physical arrangement of certain burial chambers. Details that archaeological study can identify as deliberate, but that no surviving text explains. Among the objects left in companion burial mounds, a specific category stands apart from ordinary grave goods. Standard burial practice placed weapons with the dead as marks of honor, a warrior's tools accompanying them into whatever came next. The inner circle practiced something different with certain weapons. These were not placed with the dead as the dead person's own belongings. They were placed as offerings, objects left by the living members of the inner circle, voluntarily surrendered and permanently committed to the burial site. The weapons chosen for this purpose were not ordinary. They were objects that had been used in the specific events covered by the Oath of Silence. The actions during the campaign that the inner circle had sworn never to speak of. Placing the weapons in the burial mound was a way of sealing those events more thoroughly than the oath alone could manage. The oath covered words. The weapon placement covered the physical objects connected to what the words were not allowed to describe. Together, the two forms of sealing created a layered containment around specific pieces of the companion's history. Verbal silence reinforced by physical removal. Some fans believe these weapons carried something beyond ordinary residual energy. The theory is that objects used in significant acts, then sealed with intent in stone chambers, and left undisturbed for thousands of years, accumulate a specific kind of presence that is difficult to categorize through standard magical frameworks. Not cursed in the sense of actively causing harm to anyone who touches them, more like saturated, holding the weight of what they were part of so thoroughly that the weight becomes palpable to sensitive individuals who encounter them. Several of the burial mounds in Skyrim that players can explore contain objects with unusual properties that the game does not fully explain. Some fans connect these objects to the inner circle's burial practice and to the events the original oath was designed to cover. The earliest records suggesting a blood gift within the companions predate the Thursine arrangement by a significant margin. These records are fragmentary and disputed. Scholars who study companion history do not agree on how to interpret them, but several sources from the First Era reference an inner practice among senior companions that involved a physical sharing of something between members. The language used is consistently indirect. The texts do not name what was shared. They refer to it as a strengthening, a deepening of the bond between members, a gift that carried obligation. What makes these references significant is their context. They appear in records that clearly describe the inner circle, not the wider companions, not the general membership, but specifically the small group of senior members who held the Oath of Silence and controlled succession. The gift, whatever it was restricted to this group. It was not offered to every companion. It was offered to those who had already been brought fully into the inner circle and had demonstrated they could carry what the inner circle required them to carry. Some fans believe this early blood gift was a precursor to the Thursine arrangement, a prototype that operated through different mechanisms and possibly drew on a different source. The theory suggests that the companions' inner circle had been practicing some form of blood-sharing ritual for generations before they ever approached the Glenmoral witches, and that when they did make the arrangement with Thursine, they were not beginning something new. They were formalizing and extant something that already existed in a smaller and less defined form. The Thursine deal in this reading was not a departure from Companions' tradition. It was a continuation of it, negotiated by people who already understood the concept of a gift that bound the recipient more thoroughly than the surface of the offer suggested. What the Inner Circle built in the years after the campaign was not dramatic. There were no visible ceremonies, no public announcements, no records kept in accessible places. It was a quiet structure maintained by quiet people who understood that the most durable things are the ones that do not draw attention to themselves. The wider companions continued operating as they always had, taking in new members, training fighters, building the reputation that would eventually make them the most respected warrior organization in Skyrim. Below that visible surface, the Inner Circle held its knowledge, maintained its silence, passed its obligations forward to selected successors, and buried its dead with rites that the rest of the membership never saw. Centuries passed. The original members died. The specific events covered by the oath faded from any living memory. The rites were abandoned. The weapons sat in sealed stone rooms. The early references to the blood gift were copied into later documents by scholars who did not fully understand what they were transcribing. The Inner Circle became the Circle, a name that survived even as the specific knowledge that had originally defined it slowly dissolved. What remained was the shape, the habit of holding certain things back, the instinct towards selective succession, the sense that the leadership of the companions carried something the general membership did not need to know. These were not decisions made fresh by each new generation. They were inherited patterns, behaviors that had been established by people with specific reasons for them, and that continued long after those reasons had passed out of memory. The circle before the circle left almost nothing behind that could be read directly. What it left instead was a way of operating that proved durable enough to last for thousands of years, without anyone knowing exactly where it came from. Every organization has a founding document, a charter, a set of rules written down and agreed upon so that everyone inside the organization knows what it stands for. The Mages Guild had one. Galerion the Mystic wrote it himself. Most members who joined the guild over the centuries that followed read that charter and believed they understood what they had joined. What they did not know was that the version they read was not the first version, and the first version said something very different. Galerion the Mystic was born in the Second Era on the Somerset Isles, the homeland of the Altmer, the High Elves. He studied under a mage named Celerus, who led a secretive and highly restrictive magical organization called the Psijic Order. The Psijic Order had operated for centuries by the time Galerion came through it. They controlled who had access to magical knowledge with extreme care. Membership was limited. Knowledge was rationed. The idea that magic should be available to anyone with the aptitude for it, regardless of race, background, or social standing, was not simply foreign to the Order. It was actively opposed by everything they stood for. Galerion left. He did not leave quietly or without conflict. He disagreed with the Order's fundamental approach to magical knowledge, and he said so clearly before departing. What he built afterward was a direct response to what he had left, an organization designed on the opposite principle. The Mages Guild would be open. It would have chapters across Tamriel. It would teach magic to anyone who qualified through ability rather than through birth or connection. The charter he wrote reflected these principles explicitly and without ambiguity. That charter became one of the more significant documents in Tamriel's institutional history. It created the framework for organized magical study outside of any single culture's control. It established rules about research conduct, member responsibilities, and the handling of dangerous magical materials. It set up a structure of ranks and regional leadership that allowed the guild to operate across enormous geographic distances while maintaining consistent standards. Members across Tamriel could walk into any guild hall and find the same basic organization waiting for them. The charter made that consistency possible. What the charter did not include was everything Galerion had originally written into it. Among the earliest surviving drafts of the Mages Guild Charter, fragments held in specialized collections that most guild members never accessed. There are references to a clause regarding soul gems that does not appear in the final ratified version of the document. The clause, as best as scholars have been able to reconstruct it from these fragments, placed significant restrictions on how soul gems could be used within guild research. Specifically, it drew a distinction between souls of different kinds and established that certain categories of soul were not available for use in guild enchantment work under any circumstances. The language was careful and detailed, more detailed than the rest of the charter in that section, suggesting Galerion had thought about it at length and wanted the restrictions to be precise rather than vague. He was not simply gesturing at an ethical concern. He was writing specific rules about specific soul types with specific consequences for members who violated them. This clause was removed before the charter was ratified. The records of why are incomplete. What exists suggests that the removal came after consultation between Galerion and the group of mages who would become the guild's first senior leadership. That it was not a unilateral decision by Galerion himself, but a negotiated outcome. The other founding members appear to have objected that the restrictions were too limiting for the kind of research the guild needed to conduct to remain competitive with other magical institutions. Galerion accepted the removal, but some fans believe he did not accept it without reservation. The theory holds that he removed the clause from the public document and moved the substance of it into his private archive, keeping the restrictions alive as a personal standard he intended to enforce through other means, even if they no longer appeared in the founding charter. Galerion maintained a private archive throughout his life that was separate from all official guild records. This is referenced in enough independent sources that most scholars accept it as historical fact rather than speculation. What is less agreed upon is what the archive contained and what happened to it after his death. The guild's official records were extensive: research findings, correspondence between regional leaders, documentation of significant magical discoveries, administrative records covering the organization's operation across Tamriel. All of this was held in guild facilities and was accessible, with appropriate rank, to guild members. Galerion's private archive was none of these things. It was held separately from guild facilities, maintained by people personally loyal to Galerion, rather than to the guild as an institution. And access to it was controlled entirely by him during his lifetime. What went into it? Based on the references that survive in correspondence and second-hand accounts, the archive held 3 categories of material. First, research that Galerion had conducted personally and had decided not to share with the broader guild, not because it was incomplete, but because he had judged it too sensitive for general institutional access. Second, records of decisions made during the guild's founding period that did not appear in official documentation. The negotiations around the Soul Gem Clause would fall into this category, as would other compromises made during the process of building the organization's initial structure. Third, material connected to his time in the Psijic Order. Knowledge he had acquired before leaving, that the Order had not intended him to take with him. After Galerion's death, the archive's location became unclear. Some fans believe it was absorbed into the guild's holdings by members of his inner circle who wanted to ensure the material was preserved within the institution he had built. Others believe it was deliberately hidden outside of guild reach by people who understood that certain things in it would be deeply uncomfortable for the organization if they became widely known. The archive has not surfaced in any documented form since Galerion's death. Whatever it contained, it has not found its way into the scholarly record in any traceable way. Galerion's conflict with Mannimarco is one of the most documented disagreements in the history of Tamriel's magical institutions. Mannimarco was a fellow student under Celerus in the Psijic Order, a contemporary of Galerion's, who went in a direction that placed him permanently outside any legitimate magical organization. He became the King of Worms, a necromancer of enormous power, whose work with soul magic and the undead put him in direct opposition to the guild Galerion built. The standard account of their conflict is philosophical and ethical. Galerion opposed necromancy. Mannimarco practiced it. The guild eventually banned necromantic research. Mannimarco operated outside and against the guild. This account is accurate as far as it goes. What some fans believe it omits is the material dimension of the conflict. The question of what each of them had and what each of them wanted that the other possessed. Both Galerion and Mannimarco had studied under the same teacher. Both had access to the Sigic Order's knowledge during that period. Both left the Order. Galerion by choice, Mannimarco by expulsion. The knowledge they each carried out with them overlapped in some areas and diverged significantly in others. Mannimarco's particular expertise in soul magic, in the manipulation of souls as material rather than as entities, drew on foundations that the Sigic Order had developed over centuries. Galerion understood those same foundations from the same source. The theory held by some fans is that a specific piece of knowledge changed hands between them during the period when their conflict was developing, and that the direction of that transfer was not from Mannimarco to Galerion, as the standard account might imply, but the reverse. That Mannimarco took something from Galerion's work, possibly from the private archive, possibly from guild research conducted under Galerion's direction, and used it to advance his own practice in ways that Galerion had specifically decided not to pursue. The philosophical conflict was real, but beneath it, according to this reading, was a more specific grievance about something taken and used in ways it was never intended to go. The Mages Guild's founding artifact is not prominently discussed in most accounts of the organization's history. It was not a weapon or a tool with an obvious function. It was an object Galerion had acquired during his time in the Psijic Order, brought with him when he left, kept in his personal possession throughout the guild's founding period, and eventually placed in the guild's first permanent facility as a founding deposit. The object's specific nature is not clearly described in surviving records. What the records do describe is its effect on the space around it. Mages who worked near it reported heightened clarity in their research, a sharpening of focus that made complex magical work feel more manageable. They also reported, over extended periods of proximity, a gradual difficulty in recalling certain personal memories. Not magical knowledge, not research findings, personal memories, experiences, relationships, the texture of their life outside of guild work. These faded slowly and without drama. Many of the affected mages did not notice until the fading had been going on for some time. Galerion was aware of this effect. References in the fragmentary record suggest he had observed it before placing the object in the guild facility and had decided the benefit to research outweighed the cost to personal memory. Whether he informed the mages working near the object about what it was doing to them is not recorded. What is recorded is that the object was eventually removed from the facility, quietly, without official documentation of the removal, sometime after Galerion's death. Who removed it and where it went are questions the guild's official records do not answer. The guild's first permanent facility was established on the Somerset Isles. This is documented. What is less often examined is the specific location chosen within Somerset, and why that location was selected over alternatives that would have been easier to build on, easier to access, and less politically complicated, given the Altmeri population's general attitude toward the kind of open magical access the guild represented. Galerion chose ground that had been used for magical practice before, long before, by practitioners whose methods and affiliations differed significantly from what the guild was being built to represent. The location carried residual magicka in patterns that Galerion would have recognized from his training as indicating prior concentrated use. Building on that ground gave the guild's first facility access to a natural amplification of magical work that would have taken generations to cultivate from scratch on neutral ground. Some fans believe the choice went further than practical advantage. The theory holds that the specific location was connected to research traditions that the Psijic Order had deliberately moved away from. Practices around planar access and the manipulation of boundaries between the mortal world and other planes of existence. By building the guild's first facility on that ground, Galerion was not simply taking advantage of available magical saturation. He was positioning the guild to continue work that had been conducted on that site before. Work that the Order had walked away from, but that Galerion apparently believed was worth returning to under different institutional conditions. The charter he wrote said nothing about this. The location said something that the charter carefully avoided. Galerion built an organization that outlasted him by centuries and shaped how magic operated across Tamriel for most of recorded history. The version of that organization most members knew was open, structured, and principled. A genuine attempt to make magical knowledge available beyond the narrow circles that had controlled it before him. The version underneath that was something he managed carefully and never fully described. The removed clause, the private archive, the founding artifact, and what it quietly took from the people who worked near it. The location chosen for reasons the charter did not mention. None of these contradicted what the guild publicly stood for, but together they describe a founder who understood that building something durable required decisions that could not survive being made in public, and who made those decisions deliberately, kept them separate from the official record, and left the organization he built holding foundations it was never fully told about. The charter that guild members read across the centuries was real. It described something Galerion genuinely believed in. It simply was not the whole document, and the parts he left out of it never stopped being relevant, even after he was gone. Most organizations that kill people try to hide the fact that they kill people. The Morag Tong did not. They operated openly as a sanctioned guild of assassins in Morrowind. Their writs of execution were legal documents, recognized by the great houses, enforceable in court. The killing was the public face. What sat underneath that public face was something far more structured, far more secretive, and far older than any legal document the great houses ever stamped with their seal. The Morag Tong's legal standing in Morrowind gave them something most shadow organizations never have: official cover. A member carrying a writ was not committing a crime. They were fulfilling a contracted obligation recognized by the political structure of the land they operated in. This made the Morag Tong functionally unique in Tamriel's history. They did not need to hide what they did. They only needed to hide how they did it, and more importantly, how they were organized beneath the layer that anyone with legal standing could see. The visible structure was straightforward. A client approached the Morag Tong through established channels. A writ was drawn up naming the target and the terms. A member was assigned. The execution was carried out within the specific parameters the writ described. Method, timing, and conduct were all governed by the writ's language. Payment changed hands. The matter was legally concluded. This process could be documented, referenced in court if disputed, and defended before any authority that questioned it. Below this process sat an entirely different organization. Most Morag Tong members understood their role within the visible structure and nothing beyond it. They received assignments. They carried them out. They followed the rules of conduct the guild enforced through training and reputation. What they did not have access to was the internal structure that governed the guild itself, the decision-making layer that determined which writs were accepted, which targets were made available for contracting, and what happened to members who violated the rules that were never written in any document a client would ever see. The Morag Tong maintained an internal court. This is not widely documented in general historical records. because the court's existence was one of the things the guild's unwritten rules specifically prohibited discussing outside of it. What scholars have pieced together from fragmentary sources and from the accounts of former members who spoke carefully about their experiences suggests the court operated on a set of principles entirely separate from the legal framework the guild presented publicly. The court's jurisdiction covered violations of the guild's internal code, behaviors that the public-facing rules did not address, because they were behaviors that the public-facing version of the guild officially had no opinion on. How a member spoke about the guild to outsiders, whether a member maintained the specific personal disciplines the guild expected of its experienced practitioners, how a member handled the psychological weight of their work over time. Because people who carry that weight without proper management become liabilities. And the guild had strong opinions about liabilities. Members brought before the internal court were judged by senior practitioners who held no title that appeared in any guild document. Their authority existed entirely within the internal structure. Their decisions were not appealable to any outside body, not to the great houses, not to any legal authority that recognized the guild's public standing. The outcomes ranged from assigned remediation to permanent removal from the guild in ways that left no official record of the removal having occurred. A member the court decided to remove simply stopped being a member. Their name disappeared from internal records. Their assignments were redistributed. The people who had worked alongside them were not told what had happened, only that the person in question was no longer available. Some fans believe the court also handled a category of internal matter that had nothing to do with rule violations, the management of what members knew. Specifically, the court appears to have had authority over situations where a member had acquired knowledge about the guild's deeper structure that they were not supposed to have, how that knowledge was managed, and what happened to the member who held it, was within the court's jurisdiction. This gave the internal structure a self-protecting function that operated quietly beneath every other aspect of how the guild ran. Dunmerry tradition holds specific views about souls and what happens to them after death. These views shaped how the Morag Tong understood the work they did in ways that distinguished them from other organizations that performed similar functions. For the Dunmer, a soul's path after death is not random. It is shaped by the circumstances of the death, the spiritual affiliations of the deceased, and the intentions of those who brought the death about. A person killed under a Morag Tong writ died under specific conditions. The writ named them. The killing was sanctioned. The method was governed by formal agreement. In Dunmerry spiritual understanding, this specificity mattered enormously. A death carried out under proper writ was a clean death, not morally neutral, but spiritually ordered. The soul of the person killed under a proper writ was understood to pass cleanly to whatever afterlife their own faith directed them toward. The killing did not contaminate their soul's path. The order and legality of the process protected both parties, the one who died and the one who carried out the death. This belief had practical consequences for how the Morag Tong enforced the conduct rules around writ execution. Deviations from the writ's terms, killing outside the specified parameters, using methods not sanctioned by the agreement, acting on personal motivation rather than contracted obligation, were understood as spiritually corrupting to the execution. A killing carried out incorrectly was not just a professional failure. It was a spiritual one. The soul of the person killed under an improperly executed writ did not have the same clean passage. And the member who had carried out the flawed execution carried something from that improperly handled death. Whether this belief system accurately describes what happens to souls in Elder Scrolls cosmology is a separate question. What it describes accurately is how the Morag Tong understood their own work, and why the rules around writ execution were enforced with an intensity that went beyond professional standards into something much more personal and much more permanent. Long before the Morag Tong had a name, Mephala had followers in Morrowind who organized around her specific domain: secrets, manipulation, and the kind of influence that works through people rather than around them. The theory that the Morag Tong began as one of these groups, rather than as an independent organization that later developed a connection to Mephala, is held by a significant portion of fans who study the guild's origins carefully. The evidence is circumstantial but consistent. The Morag Tong's internal structure shares characteristics with what scholars understand about Mephala's organizational preferences, specifically the layered system of knowledge, where members at each level know only what their level requires and have no access to what exists above them. This is not a common organizational design. Most institutions, even secretive ones, have porous internal boundaries where motivated members can acquire knowledge beyond their formal access. The Morag Tong's internal barriers were unusually solid and unusually maintained across a very long period of time. Maintaining that kind of compartmentalization consistently requires either extraordinary discipline or a founding principle that treats the compartmentalization itself as sacred. For an organization with roots in Mephala's worship, the compartmentalization would be sacred. Mephala's domain is the web, the system of connections where each point knows only its immediate neighbors and has no view of the whole. Building an organization on that principle is not just a security measure. It is an act of worship. Every time a member of the Morag Tong accepted that they could not know what sat above their level, they were, in this reading, enacting something devotional. The guild's legal standing in Morrowind was a later development, a practical accommodation that came after the organizational structure was already ancient. The structure itself and the principles it was built on came from somewhere much older than any Great House document. Across Tamriel, in cities and towns that the Morag Tong operated in during the Second Era and beyond, there are marks scratched into architecture that most people walk past without registering. They appear in consistent locations, at specific heights on door frames, on the undersides of particular kinds of stonework, at the corners of structures that served as waypoints between districts. They are small. They do not call attention to themselves. To the overwhelming majority of people who encounter them, they look like incidental damage, the kind of small scratches and marks that accumulate on any old stone surface over time. To Morag Tong members who knew the system, they were a complete communication network. The symbols indicated safe houses, indicated that a location had been compromised, indicated where specific resources had been cached, indicated the current threat level in a particular area. The system required no spoken communication, no written messages that could be intercepted, and no contact between members who did not already know each other. A member arriving in an unfamiliar city could read the architecture and know, within a short walk, everything operationally relevant about that location. The system's longevity is what makes it particularly worth noting. It was not invented fresh for each generation of members. It was maintained consistently across centuries of operation, updated and expanded as the guild's reach grew, and preserved with the same care the guild gave to its other internal traditions. Some of those marks still exist in Tamriel's older cities, in architecture that has survived from the Second Era into the present. Most people who see them do not know what they are looking at. A small number of people in the present day of Skyrim's Fourth Era almost certainly do. The Dark Brotherhood emerged from circumstances connected to the Morag Tong in ways that most Brotherhood members across history have never been told. The standard account of the Brotherhood's origin involves a group that broke away from the Morag Tong. Members who began performing killings without official writs, motivated by devotion to Sithis, rather than by contracted obligation. The Morag Tong, in this account, viewed the Brotherhood as a rogue offshoot, operating outside the legal and spiritual framework the guild had spent centuries constructing. What some fans believe this account omits is the question of knowledge transfer. When a group breaks away from an organization as old and as carefully structured as the Morag Tong, they do not break away empty-handed. They carry what they learned. The people who formed the earliest version of the Dark Brotherhood had been trained by the Morag Tong. They understood the guild's methods, its organizational principles, and some portion of its internal structure. The brotherhood they built reflected this. The layered knowledge system, the internal hierarchy hidden below the visible structure, the use of a spiritual framework to give the killing a meaning beyond simple contract. The Morag Tong knew all of this. They had watched the brotherhood develop from the beginning. They understood what the brotherhood had taken with them, and they held within their internal records a more complete account of the brotherhood's actual origins than the brotherhood itself maintained. Because the Morag Tong had been present at those origins in a way the brotherhood's own founding stories did not acknowledge. What the Morag Tong chose to do with that knowledge, and whether any of it has survived into the present day, is a question that the guild's characteristic silence makes very difficult to answer. The Morag Tong outlasted most of the institutions that existed alongside them in the Second Era. They operated through political upheavals that destroyed organizations far better documented and far more publicly visible than they were. The legal framework that gave them their public standing changed around them multiple times. The great houses rose and fell in influence. Morrowind's relationship with the wider empire shifted significantly across the centuries. Through all of it, the guild ran on writs. The visible structure stayed consistent. The internal structure stayed hidden. The marks on the walls of old cities kept meaning what they had always meant to the people who could read them. And the knowledge the guild held about itself, about the organizations it had outlasted, and about the ones it had helped create, stayed where the guild had always kept its most important things, in the layer that no document acknowledged and no outsider ever saw. There is a prince who has no interest in history, not because she ignores it, but because she is already inside it. Every secret kept, every organization built on hidden knowledge, every guild that holds one truth for its members and a different truth for its leadership. Mephala does not watch these things from a distance. She is woven through them. She has always been woven through them. And she will still be there when the last guild in Tamriel finally closes its doors. Mephala is one of the 17 Daedric princes. Her domain covers secrets, lies, sex, and murder, not as separate concerns, but as expressions of a single underlying interest. That interest is influenced through concealment, the manipulation of outcomes by controlling what people know, what they believe, and what they are willing to do in the dark that they would not do in the open. She is not interested in direct power. Direct power is visible. Visible things can be opposed. Mephala's preference is for the kind of power that operates through the gaps in what people understand about their situation. The influence that works because the person being influenced does not know it is happening. Her realm is called the Spiral Skein. It exists outside mortal time entirely. While kingdoms rose and fell, while eras turned and civilizations has replaced one another across Tamriel, the Spiral Skein remained exactly as Mephala made it. A vast web of connected spaces, each one isolated from the others, each one holding something that the occupants of the other spaces cannot see or access. The design of the realm is not incidental. It is a physical expression of what Mephala values. Every part of the Spiral Skein knows only what it is allowed to know. Every section is adjacent to others without being able to fully perceive them. The realm is a working model of the organizational principle she has applied to every institution she has ever touched. She predates every guild in Tamriel. She predates every kingdom. She predates the formal structures that mortals use to organize themselves entirely. What she has done across all of recorded history is not create those structures. She has moved through the ones that mortals built, finding the ones whose architecture suited her interests, and quietly adjusting the ones that did not. The earliest organized assassination networks in Tamriel did not emerge from political calculation. They emerged from religious practice, specifically from devotional communities built around Mephala. Groups who understood her domain not as abstract cosmological principle, but as a practical guide for how to operate in the world. Killing for these communities was not primarily a service rendered to clients. It was an act with spiritual meaning, a way of manipulating outcomes that had consequences beyond the physical death of a specific person. These communities developed organizational structures that reflected Mephala's principles directly. Knowledge was held in layers. No member knew more than their level required. The communities maintained external faces that gave no indication of their internal function. They built relationships with political structures that gave them legal or semi-legal standing, not because they needed the protection, but because visible legitimacy was itself a form of concealment. An organization with official standing is less likely to be investigated than one that exists entirely in shadow. The Morag Tong in this reading is one of the clearest surviving examples of what these early Mephala-rooted communities became over time. An organization that retained the structural principles of its devotional origins while acquiring the legal standing that made those principles easier to maintain over centuries. The specific theological connection faded. The organizational design did not. This is consistent with how Mephala's influence tends to work across long periods of time. She does not require ongoing acknowledgement. She requires that the structure she helped build continues functioning. Whether the people inside it still know her name is secondary. The Dark Brotherhood's central ritual, the Black Sacrament, is well documented in Skyrim's lore. A person who wants someone dead and cannot access the Brotherhood through normal channels performs the ritual alone, arranging specific objects, repeating specific words, and making an appeal that the Night Mother carries to the listener. The ritual has a fixed form. It produces consistent results when performed correctly. It is, in the language of religious practice, a liturgy, a prescribed set of actions whose meaning is contained in the doing of them rather than in any explanation attached to them. Some fans believe the Black Sacrament is not original to the Brotherhood. The theory holds that the ritual's structure, its specific requirements, and the particular quality of the appeal it makes are all consistent with Mephala's ritual traditions rather than with Sithis worship. The Brotherhood frames the sacrament as an appeal to Sithis, mediated through the Night Mother, but the Night Mother herself is, in several Elder Scrolls texts, connected to Mephala in ways that the Brotherhood's own theology does not fully account for. The Night Mother's role as a receiver and transmitter of appeals, a node in a network, holding information and passing it selectively, is structurally identical to the role of key figures in Mephala's organizational systems. The corruption theory suggests that what the Brotherhood practices as Sithis worship is a partial transformation of something older. An original Mephala ritual was adapted, reframed, and attributed to a different spiritual authority as the Brotherhood developed its own theology. The adaptation was not necessarily deliberate deception. It may have been genuine theological drift, the original meaning gradually replaced by a new interpretation as generations of Brotherhood members understood their practice through the lens of their own beliefs rather than through the lens of whoever had first designed the ritual they were performing. Mephala, in this reading, does not mind. The ritual still functions. The structure still holds. The fact that the people performing it no longer know whose design they are following is, from her perspective, entirely consistent with how she prefers to operate. Mephala's artifacts carry her domain into the physical world. The most prominent of them in Skyrim is the Ebony Blade, a two-handed sword found in Whiterun's Dragon's Reach, connected to a quest that involves using the blade to kill people the player character has befriended The blade grows more powerful with each such killing. Its power comes specifically from betrayal, from the violation of trust between people who have a genuine relationship. This is not incidental to the artifact's design. It is the design. The ebony blade does not simply reward killing. It rewards a specific kind of killing, one that destroys something valuable in the process of achieving its goal. Every use of the blade at its full potential requires the holder to end a relationship that costs something to build. The blade gets stronger. The holder's capacity for genuine connection gets weaker. Over time, a person who uses the ebony blade extensively becomes someone for whom trust is primarily a resource to be managed and eventually spent, rather than something with inherent value. This is what Mephala artifacts tend to do across Elder Scrolls lore. They do not corrupt through obvious dramatic transformation. They adjust the holder gradually in the direction of Mephala's values, toward a worldview where information is power, where relationships are leverage, where concealment is natural, and where the manipulation of outcomes through hidden influence feels not just acceptable, but preferable to direct action. The adjustment happens slowly enough that the holder can usually rationalize each step. By the time the full cost of carrying the artifact is apparent, the holder has already been shaped by it in ways that make the cost feel normal. Every major guild in Skyrim maintains a structure where different levels of membership hold different information. The companions have their circle. The Thieves Guild has its nightingales. The Dark Brotherhood has its Black Hand. The College of Winterhold has its Archmage, and the sealed levels below the main building. Each of these internal divisions serves practical purposes: security, selective succession, the management of dangerous knowledge. Each of them also serves Mephala's interests, whether or not anyone inside them knows it. This is the cosmological theory that some fans find most compelling about Mephala's relationship to Tamriel's institutions. She does not need to actively manage the organizations she has influenced. The principle she operates on, that layered knowledge with controlled access, is the most durable form of institutional power, is self-sustaining once it is built into an organization's structure. The guilds maintain their internal divisions because experience has shown them that the divisions work. They work because Mephala's principle is genuinely effective at preserving organizations across long periods of time. The fact that applying it also generates the specific quality of organizational environment that Mephala finds most interesting is not something anyone inside these organizations is positioned to notice. Some fans take this further. The theory holds that Mephala does not simply benefit from the organizational structures mortals build on her principles. She actively maintains an interest in their continuation. Organizations that threaten to become fully transparent, that move toward structures where all members have equal access to all information, tend in Tamriel's history to either collapse quickly or to quietly develop new internal divisions without fully understanding why. Mephala does not intervene dramatically. She does not send representatives or issue instructions. She simply continues being what she is, and the world around her continues organizing itself in ways that reflect her domain, because that is how her influence works. Not through action, but through the shape of what is normal. Secrets in Elder Scrolls cosmology are not simply information that has not been shared. They have a quality, a texture, that ordinary information does not. A fact known by everyone has no particular energy. A fact known by one person, or held within a sealed structure, or buried beneath layers of organizational hierarchy, carries something additional, something that accumulates over time, something that does not dissipate when the secret is eventually revealed, but transforms, leaving a residue in the people who held it and in the space where it was kept. Some fans believe Mephala feeds on this quality directly. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that she benefits from political situations created by secrets, but literally, that the energy generated by concealed knowledge is a form of sustenance for her. in the way that devotion sustains other Daedric princes. Every sealed room in every guild hall, every piece of information held at one level of an organization and kept from the levels below. Every oath of silence, sworn by people who will carry what they know until they die, all of it generating something that flows, slowly and continuously, toward the spiral sky. In this reading, Tamriel's guilds are not simply organizations that happen to share structural similarities with Mephala's preferences. They are, in a quiet and ongoing way, feeding her. The companions keep their circle's secrets. The Brotherhood keeps its hierarchy hidden. The Thieves Guild maintains its Nightingale oath. The college seals its lower levels. None of them do these things for Mephala. None of them think of themselves as serving her. But the secrets they keep are real secrets. The energy those secrets carry is real energy. And Mephala, beside time and outside history, receives it all the same. Every Dark Brotherhood member knew their sanctuary. They knew their keeper, their assignments, their contracts. They knew the 5 tenets and what breaking them cost. What almost none of them ever knew was that above their sanctuary, above their speaker, above every local authority they answered to, 5 people held the Brotherhood together. And those 5 people were never all in the same room at the same time, and most of them never knew each other's real names. The Dark Brotherhood operated across Tamriel through a network of sanctuaries, hidden facilities where members lived, trained, and received their contracts. Each sanctuary had its own internal hierarchy. A keeper managed the facility. A speaker handled communication with the outside world, and with the level of the organization above the sanctuary. The members who lived and worked within a sanctuary knew their local structure thoroughly, and the broader structure barely at all. This was deliberate. The Brotherhood's organizational design treated information about its own structure as one of its most protected assets. A member captured or compromised could only reveal what they actually knew. A member who knew their sanctuary and their immediate chain of command could not, under any pressure, reveal the location of other sanctuaries or the identities of senior figures they had never been told about. The compartmentalization was not paranoia. It was sound organizational practice developed over centuries of operating in environments where exposure meant destruction. Above the sanctuaries sat the Black Hand, 5 individuals, 4 speakers and 1 listener, who constituted the Brotherhood's actual governing authority. The speakers handled the organization's external relationships, contracts with high-profile clients, political negotiations that required the Brotherhood to interact with powers large enough to threaten it, and the management of sanctuaries that needed direction from above. The listener held a different function entirely, one that made them the most important and the most isolated figure in the entire organization. The listener did not govern in any conventional sense. They did not issue directives, manage personnel, or handle the operational details of how the Brotherhood functioned day to day. Their role was receptive rather than active. They listened. Specifically, they listened to the Night Mother, the preserved corpse of a woman who, according to Brotherhood theology, serves as Sithis' intermediary in the mortal world. The Night Mother receives the Black Sacrament when it is performed. She passes the names of those who perform it to the listener. The listener passes those names to the speakers. The speakers convert them into contracts. This chain works only if the listener can actually hear the Night Mother. The ability to receive her communication is not a skill that can be trained or a rank that can be assigned. It is a specific sensitivity that either exists in a person or does not. Finding someone with the right sensitivity at the time when a new listener is needed has historically been one of the Brotherhood's most difficult succession challenges. There have been periods in the organization's history when no functioning listener existed, when the Night Mother's communications went unheard and the Black Sacrament produced no response. During these periods, the Brotherhood operated on existing contracts and internal work only. The organization continued. The upper functions simply went silent. The psychological cost of the listener role is not widely discussed in Brotherhood records. What fragmentary accounts suggest is that sustained regular contact with the Night Mother's communications changed the people who served as listener over time. Not dramatically, not in ways that were visible to outsiders or even to other Brotherhood members, but in ways the listeners themselves noted in what private records they kept. The voice of the Night Mother, received regularly over years, carried something beyond the names it transmitted, a quality that those who experienced it described consistently as weight, as the accumulation of something that had no clear category, but that made certain ordinary experiences of life feel progressively more distant. The purification was the Brotherhood's most severe internal action. It was not applied to individual members who broke rules. That level of violation was handled through other means. The purification was reserved for situations where an entire sanctuary had been compromised beyond recovery, where enough members had been exposed, turned, or corrupted that the facility itself could no longer function as a safe and reliable part of the organization. When a purification was ordered, a senior member, typically a speaker acting under Black Hand authority, entered the affected sanctuary and killed everyone inside it. Every member, every keeper, every person living within those walls, regardless of their individual culpability for whatever had compromised the sanctuary. The action was total. The sanctuary was then sealed and abandoned. The Brotherhood's theology framed the purification as a gift to Sithis, a mass offering of souls that fed the void and honored the Brotherhood's fundamental commitment to its spiritual authority. This framing served a real organizational purpose. It made the purification something that members understood as sacred, rather than simply brutal. A member who knew the purification existed was not living under an arbitrary threat of massacre. They were living with the knowledge that if their sanctuary became a liability to the whole, their death would mean something within the framework they had committed their life to. What the theology did not address, and what some fans believe the Brotherhood's leadership understood clearly, even if they did not say it, was the cost the purification imposed on the organization itself. Each purification removed trained members, established relationships, and accumulated institutional knowledge that could not be recovered. A sanctuary destroyed in a purification did not simply lose its physical facility. It lost everything that had been built inside it over whatever years it had operated. The Brotherhood that continued after a purification was smaller and less capable than the Brotherhood before it. The spiritual framing made the loss acceptable. It did not make the loss not a loss. The Night Mother's physical form, her preserved corpse, travels with the Brotherhood. It is kept in a coffin. The coffin moves when the Brotherhood relocates, when sanctuaries are established or abandoned, when the organization's center of gravity shifts across Tamriel. Where the Night Mother is, the Brotherhood's spiritual authority is concentrated. Her presence in a sanctuary is not simply symbolic. It is functionally significant to how the Brotherhood operates. Members who spend extended time near the coffin report experiences consistent enough across different accounts to suggest they reflect something real rather than individual imagination. A growing sense of being observed, not by anyone present, by something adjacent to the room, close enough to perceive but not physically located in the space. Dreams that carry a quality distinct from ordinary dreaming, often involving communication that the dreamer struggles to remember clearly upon waking. A progressive shift in how the person experiences silence, where silence stops feeling like the absence of sound and starts feeling like the presence of something that has simply chosen not to make any noise yet. Whether these experiences represent genuine contact with Sithis' realm, or with the Night Mother's preserved spiritual presence, or with something else entirely, is a question the Brotherhood's theology answers in one way and outside scholars answer in several others. What is consistent across all accounts is the directionality of the change. Extended proximity to the Night Mother's coffin moves people in a specific direction, away from ordinary emotional and perceptual experience, towards something quieter, more attenuated, and more comfortable with the idea of void than most living people would naturally choose to become. Sithis is described in Brotherhood theology as the original void, the nothing that existed before creation, the emptiness that Anu and Padme emerged from when existence began. He is worshipped as a deity. Prayers are addressed to him. The Brotherhood's entire spiritual framework is built around serving his will and feeding his void with the souls of the dead. Some fans believe Sithis is not a deity in any meaningful sense. The theory holds that what the Brotherhood calls Sithis is a gap, a place in the structure of existence where something is absent. Anu and Padme are described in Elder Scrolls creation mythology as the two primal forces whose interaction generated existence. If Anu represents stasis and Padme represents change, then whatever existed before both of them, the condition that made their emergence possible, has no qualities. It is not a being. It is the absence of being. It has no will, no preferences, no capacity to receive worship or to reward devotion. In this reading, the Night Mother does not communicate on Sithis's behalf, because Sithis has instructions to give. She communicates because she is a preserved spiritual presence, with her own capacity for perception and transmission, operating in the space adjacent to the void, without being the void itself. The Brotherhood worships the gap and receives something real in return. But what they receive comes from the Night Mother, not from Sithis. The void simply provides the conditions that make her particular kind of communication possible. It is the medium, not the message, and the organization built around serving it has, for all of its history, been directing its devotion at an absence, while the real authority it answers to watches quietly from inside the coffin it has been carrying from sanctuary to sanctuary across the long centuries of its existence. The Black Hand held the Brotherhood together through its most difficult periods. Political shifts that exposed other organizations left the Brotherhood intact because the Black Hand's design made the organization nearly impossible to fully compromise. Taking down one sanctuary did not reach the hand. Finding one speaker did not reveal the others. The listener was, by the nature of their role, among the most isolated individuals in any organization operating in Tamriel. This durability came at a cost paid by everyone inside the structure. Isolation at every level. Knowledge rationed to what each person's function required. A spiritual framework that gave meaning to experiences. The weight the listener carried. The cost of the purification. The presence near the coffin. That would otherwise be very difficult to sustain. The Brotherhood asked a great deal of the people inside it. What it offered in return was clarity of purpose, the specific comfort of belonging to something with a long history and a defined place in the world, and the knowledge that what they did mattered within a framework that had been running long before they joined, and would continue running long after they were gone. For the people who chose it, that was enough. For most of them, it was more than enough. It was everything. Most oaths have terms that both sides understand before they are sworn. The Nightingale Oath is not most oaths. The people who take it stand in a dark chamber, speak words that have been spoken by others before them, and accept a bargain with a Daedric prince, whose domain is the things that are never fully brought into the light. What they are told about the agreement is real. It is simply not complete, and the parts left out are the parts that matter most. Not during the Nightingale's life, but after it. Nocturnal is the Daedric prince of night and darkness. Her domain covers shadow, luck, and the things that move through the world without being seen. She is not warmly described in most Elder Scrolls texts. She does not present herself as a patron in any generous sense. She makes arrangements. She receives what those arrangements entitle her to. What the people on the other side of her arrangements receive is real and functional. She delivers what she promises. The terms, however, are written in a language that rewards very careful reading and punishes assumptions. The Thieves Guild's connection to Nocturnal runs deeper than most members ever discover. Most guild members operate without any direct relationship to her at all. They steal. They follow the guild's code. They benefit from the general luck that the guild's nocturnal connection generates, without ever knowing the source of that luck or what it costs. The Nightingales are the specific subset of the guild who enter into direct relationship with Nocturnal, who take the oath, wear the armor, and accept the obligations that the broader membership never has to think about. The number of active Nightingales at any given time is small. 3 is traditional, a number with specific significance in Nocturnal's framework. Each Nightingale swears the same oath. Each accepts the same visible terms. Service to Nocturnal during their life, and service of a different kind after their death. What they are told about the post-death service is that they will guard the Twilight Sepulchre, Nocturnal's primary place of power in the mortal world, for as long as Nocturnal requires. What they are not told is what "as long as Nocturnal requires" actually means in practice. The skeleton key appears in Skyrim's Thieves Guild questline as an artifact of enormous value, an unbreakable lockpick that can open any lock. This description is accurate as far as it goes. The key does what it is described as doing. What the description omits is what the key is in addition to being a tool. In Elder Scrolls cosmology, locks are not simply mechanical devices. They are a concept. The idea of a boundary between access and restriction, between the known and the hidden. Nocturnal's domain includes this concept directly. She governs not just physical shadow, but the shadow of concealment. The darkness that exists in the gap between what is and what is known. The skeleton key in this framework is not primarily a lockpick. It is an artifact that embodies Nocturnal's relationship to that concept. Some fans believe the key works in reverse. A conventional key opens a specific lock. The skeleton key opens any lock, which means it does not work by matching a mechanism. It works by dissolving the distinction between locked and unlocked entirely. Every lock it touches stops being a lock in the moment the key is applied. The barrier simply ceases to function as a barrier. The theory extends from here. If the skeleton key dissolves barriers, if that is its actual function rather than a side effect of its construction, then removing it from the Twilight Sepulchre does not simply inconvenience Nocturnal. It removes something that was maintaining a specific barrier in her realm. The Sepulchre is described in the game as a place where Nocturnal's influence flows into the mortal world, a conduit between her realm and Tamriel. The key, kept within the Sepulchre, was holding something open, not a door, something more fundamental, a channel, a consistent gap in the boundary between Nocturnal's plane and the mortal world, through which her influence could flow steadily. When the key was stolen, that channel became unstable. The luck the guild had operated on for generations began to fail, not because Nocturnal withdrew it in anger, but because the mechanism maintaining it had been physically removed. Nightingale armor is distinctive. Players who encounter it in the game recognize it immediately. Dark, elegant, fitted with silver detailing that catches light in ways the surrounding darkness does not quite account for. It is one of the most recognizable sets of equipment in Skyrim. What it looks like is well understood. What it does to the person wearing it over extended periods is less discussed. The armor is enchanted with Nocturnal's specific kind of magic, shadow-based, luck-adjacent, operating in the gaps between what is normally possible and what the armor makes available. These enchantments are functional and beneficial. They make the wearer harder to detect, more capable in the specific activities the Thieves Guild values, and more attuned to the kind of work Nocturnal's pact is designed to support. They also adjust the wearer. Not dramatically, not in ways that announce themselves. The adjustment is gradual and consistent, a slow reorientation of the person's relationship to light and darkness, to visibility and concealment, to the experience of being seen versus being present without being noticed. A nightingale who has worn the armor for years begins to find ordinary visibility uncomfortable in a way they cannot fully articulate. Lit rooms feel exposing. Crowds feel loud in a way that has nothing to do with actual sound levels. The instinct toward shadow, toward operating from positions that cannot be easily observed, becomes not just a professional preference, but a genuine perceptual comfort. Some fans connect this to the post-death obligation. A person reshaped by years of nightingale armor toward comfort in shadow and discomfort in full visibility is a person who, after death, will find the Twilight Sepulchre's specific environment less foreign than it would otherwise be. Nocturnal, in this reading, is not simply extracting post-death service as a contractual obligation. She is preparing her nightingales for it throughout their lives, through the artifact they wear, so that when they arrive in her service after death, they are already oriented toward what she needs them to become. The luck the Thieves Guild operates on is real. Members who have been with the guild for years describe a consistent quality to their work. Jobs that should go wrong do not. Openings appear in situations that should have none. The specific kind of fortunate coincidence that skilled thieves learn to recognize and use presents itself with unusual regularity. This is not simply the result of skill and experience, though both matter. It is something additional, something that the guild's connection to Nocturnal provides in a way that guild members who know about the Nightingale Pact understand, and guild members who do not know simply experience without explanation. The standard interpretation is that Nocturnal grants luck to her affiliated organization as a benefit of the arrangement. Some fans believe this interpretation is slightly wrong in a way that matters. The theory holds that Nocturnal does not generate luck and distribute it. She removes resistance. Luck, in this framework, is the natural state of a skilled practitioner operating in their area of competence. What normally prevents skilled people from consistently experiencing fortunate outcomes is interference, the accumulated friction of a world that does not particularly care whether any individual person succeeds or fails. Nocturnal's arrangement does not add anything to the Thieves Guild's operation. It removes the friction that would otherwise distribute their outcomes more randomly. The difference between these two interpretations is subtle, but has significant implications. If Nocturnal grants luck, she can withdraw it. And the guild's failure during the period when the skeleton key was missing is evidence of her doing so. If Nocturnal removes resistance, then what failed when the key was stolen was the mechanism maintaining the removal. The channel through the sepulchre that kept the interference cleared. The guild did not lose Nocturnal's favor. They lost the infrastructure of the arrangement. Getting the key back and returning it to the sepulchre did not restore a gift. It repaired a mechanism. The Nightingale Oath covers two duties explicitly. The first is active service during the Nightingale's life, protecting the sepulchre, maintaining the guild's connection to Nocturnal, carrying out whatever Nocturnal requires through the arrangement. The second is post-death service, remaining in the sepulchre as a guardian after death, for the duration Nocturnal requires. Some fans who have studied the oath carefully believe a third duty exists, one that is not stated during the swearing and is not described in any document associated with the Nightingale tradition that has survived into the present. The evidence for this belief is indirect. It comes from the behavior of Nightingale guardians encountered in the Twilight Sepulchre. The spirits of former Nightingales who died and remained in service as the oath required. These figures behave in ways that are consistent with the second duty. They guard, they maintain their posts, but they also appear to do something additional, something that cannot be fully explained by guarding alone. The sepulchre's interior contains areas that seem to process something flowing through them. Not simply physical space that needs to be protected, but a function that requires active maintenance. The guardian spirits appear to participate in this maintenance, not as guards preventing intrusion, as components of something operational. Some fans believe the third duty is this: that nightingales after death do not simply guard the sepulchre, but become part of its function, part of the mechanism that keeps the channel between Nocturnal's realm and the mortal world stable and open. They are not protecting the skeleton key's housing, they are partially replacing what the key does. Each nightingale who dies and enters service adds something to the sepulchre's capacity. Over generations, the accumulation of former nightingales in post-death service has built something inside the sepulchre that no single oath-taking ever anticipated. A structure made of people, holding open a door between worlds, without any of them having been told that was what they were agreeing to. Nocturnal does not explain herself. This is consistent across every Elder Scrolls text that addresses her. She does not justify her arrangements. She does not describe her intentions. She offers terms. The terms are real. What is built into the terms, what they serve beyond their surface function, is not something she discusses. People who enter into agreements with her receive what they were promised. They do not receive a full account of what their agreement is actually for. The nightingales who have served across the Third Era and into the Fourth have been, in this sense, operating with partial information throughout. They knew their duty. They knew the armor and what it did for their work. They understood the post-death obligation well enough to accept it. What none of them were told, what no document associated with the Nightingale tradition has ever stated, is the full picture of what their service builds, what the sepulchre functions as, and what Nocturnal is maintaining through the arrangement she has been running with the Thieves Guild across all these generations. The oath they took was real. The service they gave was real. The armor changed them in real ways over real years of wearing it. What they built through that service, what accumulates inside the sepulchre with every nightingale who dies and remains, is something none of them agreed to specifically, because none of them were told it was part of what they were agreeing to. Nocturnal received their consent to the terms she stated. The rest she simply received. Anu and Padme are the two forces Elder Scrolls creation mythology begins with. Stasis and change, being and becoming. Their interaction generated everything that exists. Every plane, every soul, every moment of time that has ever passed in any world. Most creation stories start here and move forward. But there is a question that sits behind this beginning, that very few texts address directly. If Anu and Padme were the first things, what were they before they were anything? What is the condition that makes a beginning possible? The Dark Brotherhood has a name for it. They call it Sithis. And what Sithis actually is, beneath the name, beneath the theology, beneath the centuries of Brotherhood ritual built around it, is something far quieter and far stranger than any god. The oldest Dark Brotherhood texts available to scholars describe Sithis in language that differs significantly from what newer members of the organization are taught. Modern Brotherhood theology presents Sithis as a deity, a being with will, with preferences, with the capacity to receive devotion and to reward service. The Night Mother is his bride, the void is his realm. Souls offered to him through Brotherhood contract work feed him and honor him. This is the version of Sithis that Brotherhood members learn when they join. And it is the version that has been consistent across the organization's more recent centuries of operation. The older texts do not describe a being, they describe a condition. Sithis, in the oldest surviving Brotherhood documents, is not something that exists. It is the property of not existing, the quality of absence itself. The text use language that is careful and consistent across multiple sources. Sithis is not in the void. Sithis is what void means. The distinction matters enormously. A being in the void can have a relationship with mortals, can receive prayers, can respond to devotion, can make arrangements. A condition that defines what void is cannot do any of these things. It has no agency. It has no preferences. It simply is the character of emptiness, wherever emptiness exists. This creates a significant question about the Brotherhood's entire theological framework. If the oldest texts describe Sithis as a condition rather than a being, where did the personified version come from? Some fans believe the personification was a practical development, that early Brotherhood members found it more useful to worship a being than to orient their practice around an abstract condition, and that the theology shifted accordingly over generations. Others believe the personification was deliberate, that someone in the Brotherhood's history made a specific decision to reframe Sithis as a deity, because a deity could be used to justify institutional authority in ways that an abstract condition could not. When a soul is offered to Sithis through Brotherhood contract work, where does it go? Brotherhood theology has a clear answer: to the void, to Sithis, to the darkness that the Prince of Death governs. The soul feeds the void. It honors the contract. It goes where souls dedicated to Sithis are meant to go. Some fans believe the honest answer is simpler and more difficult. If Sithis is not a being but a condition, if the void is not a realm with geography and population, but the actual property of non-existence, then a soul offered to Sithis does not go anywhere. It stops. It does not travel to a dark realm and join other offered souls in an eternal population. It simply ceases to have the properties that make a soul what it is. The information that constituted the person, their experiences, their personality, their specific character, dissolves back into the undifferentiated nothing that preceded existence. This is not presented in Elder Scrolls lore as a confirmed fact. It is a theory held by fans who take the oldest descriptions of Sithis seriously and follow their implications carefully. But it has significant consequences for how the Brotherhood's work is understood. If the theory is correct, Brotherhood contract killings do not send souls to a Daedric realm, where they continue to exist in some form. They end those souls in the most complete sense possible. The people killed under Brotherhood contract do not go anywhere after death. They simply stop being people. The Brotherhood in this reading is not a death cult in the sense of one devoted to the afterlife. It is something more absolute, an organization devoted to the complete termination of specific existences, framed in theological language that makes this termination feel meaningful rather than simply final. The listener's experience of sustained contact with the Night Mother's communications has been documented across multiple accounts. These accounts are consistent enough that the pattern they describe is worth examining carefully. The change that occurs in listeners over time moves in one direction. It does not move toward intensity or toward any heightened engagement with the world. It moves toward attenuation, toward a progressive thinning of the membrane between the listener's ordinary experience and the quality of the void itself. Listeners report, across these accounts, a growing difficulty in caring about things that previously mattered to them. Not a loss of ability to function, not depression in any clinical sense, more like a gradual clarification, as if the things they had previously valued were being slowly revealed as less substantial than they had appeared. The relationships, the preferences, the small daily investments that constitute an ordinary life begin to feel like the surface of something rather than the thing itself. What lies below the surface, the quieter layer that the Night Mother's voice seems to come from, begins to feel more real than the surface does. Some fans believe this is the void's actual effect on sustained proximity. Not corruption in the dramatic sense of something being damaged. A slow alignment, a gradual reorganization of the listener's perceptual priorities toward what the void fundamentally is. Less, quieter, more absent than present. The listener does not become evil or unstable. They become, incrementally, less attached to the properties of existence that make existence feel valuable. By the end of a long listener's service, what they experience of daily life is real but thin. The void, in contrast, has become something that feels almost comfortable, almost like where they were always heading, one communication at a time. The Night Mother is not described warmly in any Elder Scrolls text that addresses her directly. She is functional. She receives the Black Sacrament. She transmits the names to the listener. She maintains her role within the Brotherhood's operational structure, with consistency across centuries. What she is not described as is caring about any of this. She performs her function. The function continues, whether she has preferences about it, whether she would choose it if she could choose otherwise, is not a question the available texts engage with. Some fans believe the Night Mother's relationship with Sithis is not the companionate one Brotherhood theology describes. The theological framing presents her as his bride, a partner in the Void's work, present with him in a relationship that gives the Brotherhood's operation a kind of divine marriage at its center. The older texts are less comfortable. They describe the Night Mother as a vessel, a specific kind of container that is useful to whatever Sithis is because of its particular properties. A preserved mortal soul, maintained in a specific state, positioned at the boundary between the mortal world and the void, capable of receiving certain kinds of communication that cross that boundary and transmitting them to a mortal recipient. In this reading, the Night Mother is not Sithis' companion. She is his instrument. The distinction is not one the Brotherhood's theology has historically wanted to examine, because the companion framing gives the organization a center with warmth and meaning, a divine relationship at its core that makes the Brotherhood's work feel like participation in something sacred rather than service to something that does not actually experience the service being rendered. Whether Sithis experiences anything at all is, given the oldest descriptions of what Sithis actually is, a genuinely open question. The creation mythology of Elder Scrolls places Anu and Padme at the beginning of everything. They are the first two things. Their interaction, the interplay between stasis and change, between the tendency toward being and the tendency toward becoming, produced existence itself. Every plane, every soul, every moment is a result of that original interaction playing out across infinite time and space. The theory that Sithis predates Anu and Padme is cosmologically significant in a way that does not fully register until you sit with it carefully. If Anu and Padme are the first two things, they needed a condition to emerge into. Something had to be there before them, not as a place, not as a being, but as the property that made their emergence possible. Emergence requires somewhere to emerge from. The nothing that preceded Anu and Padme is not simply the absence of them. It is the specific character of what existed before anything existed, the quality of the state that their arrival changed. The Dark Brotherhood calls that quality Sithis. In this reading, Sithis is not younger than the creation mythology. He is the precondition of it. Anu and Padme did not emerge from a neutral nothing. They emerged from something with a specific character, a character that has persisted within existence ever since, not as a separate realm, but as a property embedded in reality itself. Every moment of silence, every space between things, every gap where something is absent. These are not simply the absence of Sithis. They are Sithis, the original condition still present within the existence that displaced it, the way that cold is still present in ice that is slowly warming. The Brotherhood did not invent a god. They found something that had always been there and learned to orient themselves toward it. Whether that orientation constitutes worship in any meaningful sense depends entirely on what you believe worship requires on the other end. The void does not announce itself. It does not compete with the things that exist around it. It simply continues being what it is. The condition that predates everything, present in every gap that existence has not quite filled, waiting in the silence between every sound that has ever been made in any world. The Brotherhood built an organization around it. They gave it a name. They developed theology to explain their relationship to it, and rituals to maintain that relationship across generations. All of this is human. The need to make something nameable and approachable out of something that is, by definition, neither. What the void itself does with all this attention is the question that the oldest texts keep returning to and never quite answering. The condition that preceded existence does not need devotion. It does not benefit from souls offered to it in the way that a Daedric prince benefits from worship. It does not hear the black sacrament or receive the prayers directed at it or experience the Night Mother's mediation on its behalf. It simply continues, the same way it continued before Anu and Padme, the same way it will continue after the last soul in any world has finished whatever it was doing and gone wherever souls finally go. The Brotherhood calls it Sithis. It does not call itself anything. It has always been exactly what it is. The silence that everything else is spoken into, still and patient and older than the first word ever said. Kodlak Whitemane was the harbinger of the companions. He did not command them. The companions have never had a commander in any formal sense. He guided them. He set the tone. He was the person the circle looked to when difficult decisions needed to be made. And the right answer was not obvious. He was also, for the last years of his life, carrying something that none of them knew he was carrying. A weight he had chosen to hold alone rather than distribute to the people around him. For reasons that say more about who he was than almost anything else recorded about him. The harbinger position in the companions carries no formal authority. This is not an accident of tradition. It is a deliberate design going back to the organization's earliest structure. The idea that the companions are not an organization where commands flow downward from a single leader, but one where experience and wisdom create influence rather than rank creating power. The harbinger is the most experienced and most respected member. Their guidance is followed because it is trusted, not because it is required. A companion who genuinely disagreed with the harbinger's position was free to say so. In practice, this rarely happened with Kodlak. He had earned his position through decades of service, and the circle trusted his judgment in the way that trust is built. Slowly, through consistent behavior across many different kinds of situations. What the circle did not know was that the judgment they trusted was being applied to a problem Kodlak had not told them about. He knew things about the companion's relationship with Haseen that the rest of the circle had not been given, not because the information was new. It had been held at the harbinger level for generations, passed from one harbinger to the next as part of assuming the role, the full terms of the original arrangement. The specific implications for what happened to beast-blooded companions after death. The complete picture of what the inner circle had agreed to. Not the version that was shared with circle members when they received the beast blood, but the unabbreviated account that had been maintained separately since the arrangement was first made. Kodlak received this information when he became harbinger. He carried it, and he did what none of the harbingers before him had done with it. He began trying to find a way out. The research Kodlak conducted into curing beast blood was not something he discussed openly within the companions. The circle knew by the time of Skyrim's Fourth Era events that he wanted to be free of the beast blood before he died. This much he had shared with them. What he had not shared was the full scope of what he had been investigating, how long he had been investigating it, and what he had learned in the course of that investigation. He had been working on the problem for years before he told anyone in the circle that it was something he thought about. The initial research was conducted through channels that did not advertise their purpose. Correspondence with scholars who studied Daedric arrangements in general terms, without revealing the specific arrangement he was trying to understand. Reading done privately in the hours when the hall was quiet and the rest of the companions were occupied elsewhere, slowly building an understanding of how Daedric soul claims worked, what conditions could interrupt them, and whether any interruption of the specific claim Haseen held on the companions was theoretically possible? The answer he eventually reached was yes, but the mechanism was specific and required access to something the companions had not maintained a consistent relationship with. The Glenmoral witches, who had brokered the original arrangement, also held the means to interrupt it, their heads, removed and brought to the flame of the Harbinger's hearth, could purify the beast blood from a soul seeking release. This was not information Kodlak found quickly. It was information he assembled carefully over a long period, through sources that required patience to develop and trust to access. He also learned during this research something he chose not to share with the Circle, even after he began discussing his desire for a cure. The interruption process worked for souls that actively sought release. It did not automatically extend to souls that had not requested it. The cure, applied to Kodlak's soul, would free Kodlak. It would not free every beast-blooded companion who had died before him and passed to Hircine's realm. The release was individual. The problem was organizational, and the full organizational problem was something Kodlak understood completely and chose to hold rather than lay down in front of people he cared about and could not fully help. Kodlak was not the first Harbinger to want what he wanted. The pattern of Harbingers who privately researched the possibility of freeing the companions from Hircine's claim stretches back further than any current Circle member knows. The reason this pattern is not commonly known is that none of these earlier Harbingers left records that survived in accessible form. Their research was conducted privately. Their findings were held personally, and when they died, what they had learned died with them, or was absorbed into the same restricted knowledge that the next Harbinger inherited. What can be inferred from the structure of what Kodlak received when he became Harbinger is that at least some of his predecessors had gotten further than the public record suggests. The information he inherited was too specific to have been assembled from scratch by each individual Harbinger. It had been built up over multiple generations, each Harbinger adding to what the previous one had found, passing the accumulated understanding forward as part of the restricted knowledge that came with the role. Kodlak received this accumulated understanding and recognized it for what it was. Previous Harbingers had been working on the same problem. They had contributed to a collective body of research that none of them had been able to bring to completion. He was inheriting not just a position, but an unfinished project, one that had been running, quietly and privately, across more Harbinger terms than anyone outside the restricted knowledge had any reason to suspect. Why none of them had succeeded is a question the inherited information does not fully answer. What it records are the approaches that had been tried and had not worked, the paths that had been explored and found insufficient. The Glenmoral witch solution that Kodlak eventually identified was not in the inherited material. He found it through his own research, building on the foundation his predecessors had left. The foundation told him what would not work. The additional research told him what might. Wuthrad was restored during the events of Skyrim's Companion's questline. Its fragments, scattered and held across different locations, brought together and reforged by Eorland Greymane at the Skyforge. The restored weapon functions as it was designed to function. It is powerful against elves, specifically against the snow elves the 500 had fought when the weapon first carved its history. It carries the visual and functional markers of its original design. What it also carries, according to some fans, is something that the reforging process cannot remove. The fragments of Wuthrad had been separated for a long time. During that separation, each fragment had existed independently, no longer part of the complete weapon, no longer functioning as the oath-binding object the original 500 had understood it to be. But the quality that made it an oath-binding object in the first place had not been in the completeness of the weapon. It had been in the material, in the metal itself, in whatever property of the axe head had made it an appropriate witness for the oath spoken before the crossing. That property does not leave metal when metal is broken. It does not disperse into the fragments and vanish when they are separated. It remains in each piece, diminished by the separation, waiting in the material the way that it had always waited. Patient, present, not requiring any particular conditions to persist. When the fragments were brought back together and reforged, that property reconcentrated. The restored Wuthrad does not simply function as the original weapon. It carries the accumulated weight of everything the fragments held during their long separation, the oath, the original promise, and whatever the fragments had absorbed from the locations where they had been kept across the centuries between the original breaking and the restoration. What a sensitive practitioner might feel holding the restored weapon is not simply the power of an ancient Nord artifact. It is something more layered and more particular than that. Something that has been waiting, spread across several separated pieces, for a very long time to be whole again. Hircine's interest in Kodlak Whitemane was not passive. This is something some fans believe the game's events imply without stating directly. Hircine does not intervene dramatically in mortal affairs in most of his lore appearances. He watches, he waits, he trusts that the arrangements he has made will run themselves without requiring his active involvement. But a harbinger actively researching how to break his claim on an entire organization's worth of souls, and getting close enough to a viable method to actually find one, represents a specific kind of threat to an arrangement he had been running successfully for a very long time. The theory holds that Hircine was aware of what Kodlak was doing and made efforts to prevent it reaching completion, not through dramatic intervention, through the quieter mechanisms available to a Daedric prince with a pre-existing connection to the people involved. Beast blood affects the mind. The harbinger carried beast blood, the specific qualities the blood enhances, the pull toward the hunt, the instinct toward predatory awareness, the comfort with certain kinds of darkness, are qualities that Hircine can, in theory, adjust the intensity of. Kodlak's declining health in his final years is described in the game as a function of age and the difficulty of managing beast blood in an older body. Some fans believe Hircine was less passive about that decline than the surface account suggests, that what looked like natural deterioration was at least partially the result of a Daedric prince, quietly making it harder for a specific mortal to complete a project that threatened his holdings. Whether Hircine almost succeeded depends on how close Kodlak actually was when he died. He had found the mechanism. He had not completed the process. His death interrupted the work at the last stage, rather than anywhere earlier. Hircine, if he had been managing Kodlak's decline, ran it very close. The project survived because others carried it forward after Kodlak was gone, but only barely, and only because Kodlak had done enough of the work, alone and in private, to leave a thread for someone else to follow to the end. The College of Winterhold stands on a cliff that is still falling. The rock beneath it has been eroding for centuries. Most of the city that once surrounded it slid into the sea in a single catastrophic event at the start of the Fourth Era. The college survived, the buildings around it did not. What most people who study the college focus on is what remains standing above the ice. Very few ask what remains standing below it. In the sections that survived the collapse, not because they were protected by magic, but because they were already underground when everything above them gave way. The Great Collapse happened early in the Fourth Era. Within a short period, the city of Winterhold lost most of its structures to a catastrophic coastal erosion event that the people of Skyrim blamed on the college. The mages who lived and worked there did not cause it. The evidence for that conclusion has never been strong, but the timing was difficult to argue against from the perspective of people who had just watched their city disappear into the sea, while the college remained untouched on its promontory. The relationship between the college and the city of Winterhold has been cold ever since, in both senses of the word. What the accounts of the Great Collapse do not address in any detail is what happened to the parts of the college that were below ground level at the time. The building that visitors see today, the courtyard, the Hall of the Elements, the Archmage quarters, the individual towers, represents what survived above the cliff's surface. But the college, like most structures of its age and ambition, had been built downward as well as upward. Foundations that went deeper than the visible architecture required. Storage levels designed to take advantage of the natural temperature stability underground. Research spaces positioned below the main building, specifically because certain kinds of work benefited from isolation from the activity above. When the coastal erosion occurred and the ground around the college shifted and fell, these lower levels did not disappear with the rest of Winterhold. The cliff the college stands on held. The underground sections within that cliff held with it. They survived, structurally intact, sealed by the collapse of the access points that had connected them to the upper building, and sitting undisturbed beneath the feet of every mage who has walked the college grounds in the centuries since. The Archmage position at the College of Winterhold carries administrative responsibilities that any senior faculty member understands. The Archmage manages the college's relationships with external institutions, oversees the research conducted within its walls, handles the discipline of students and faculty who require it, and represents the college in any official capacity that requires a single authoritative voice. All of this is known. All of this is visible. What is not visible, what is passed from one archmage to the next in a specific and private transfer that occurs outside of any formal ceremony, is a set of keys, not metaphorical keys, physical objects, several of them of different designs, corresponding to different sealed access points within the college's structure. Some of these keys open doors that other faculty members know exist, but have never been able to pass through. Others open access points that the general faculty does not know are there. Entrances to spaces that have never appeared in any document describing the college's layout. The tradition of passing these keys is old enough that the faculty members who have received them over the centuries have not all agreed on what they unlock or why those spaces were sealed. Some archmages, upon receiving the keys, investigated the spaces they accessed and left records of what they found. Records kept separately from official college documentation, in locations that subsequent archmages would find as part of the same private transfer. Others received the keys and chose not to use them, adding their own observations about why they had decided to leave the sealed spaces sealed. The accumulated record of what different archmages have done with this access forms its own private history of the college. A parallel account running alongside the official one, held only by the people who have occupied the top position. The deepest section of the college's surviving underground levels contains objects that have never been moved. This is not because they could not be moved. It is because each archmage who has accessed that section and considered moving them has, after examining the situation carefully, decided to leave them where they are. The objects themselves are varied, not a collection assembled around a single theme, but an accumulation from different periods of the college's history, representing different research programs and different institutional priorities. What they share is a quality that makes their removal feel inadvisable to anyone with sufficient magical sensitivity to perceive it. They have been in that space for a very long time. The space has been sealed for most of that time. The interaction between objects held in close proximity in a sealed underground environment for centuries without any external influence or interference produces conditions that scholars of magical theory describe as deep saturation, a state where the objects and the space around them have become so thoroughly adjusted to each other that disturbing the arrangement carries unpredictable consequences. Some fans believe specific objects in this section were placed there deliberately, not stored for later retrieval, but permanently committed to that location as a containment measure. Objects whose properties made them too significant to destroy and too dangerous to maintain in accessible areas. Objects whose presence in the deeper levels serves a function, contributing to the specific quality of that underground space in ways that the ceiling was designed to maintain, rather than simply to protect against intrusion. Removing one of these objects would not simply empty a shelf. It would alter a balance that has been building for a very long time, in a location that sits directly beneath a building full of people who do their most sensitive work on the floors above it. The Eye of Magnus was found during events that Skyrim players who completed the college questline experienced directly, a powerful artifact of enormous magical significance, connected to the ancient Magnus, the god of magic who left the mortal world when it was created, and whose departure left behind the sun as a hole in the sky through which magicka flows. The eye was discovered in ruins near Sarthal, was brought to the college, and nearly destroyed everything before the situation was resolved. The standard account frames the discovery as unexpected, an artifact found by students during an authorized excavation that turned out to be far more significant than anyone anticipated. Some fans believe the discovery was not as unexpected as it appeared, and that the unexpected element was not the eye's existence, but the timing of its surfacing. The theory holds that the Eye of Magnus was not simply waiting in the Sarthal ruins without any connection to the college. Something beneath the college, in those deep sealed levels, in the quality of the space that has been building for centuries, had been in relationship with the eye for a long time. Not a relationship that anyone designed or intended. A relationship of resonance between an artifact of Magnus's power and something in the ground beneath the one institution in Skyrim, dedicated entirely to the study and practice of his domain. The eye, in this reading, did not surface randomly. It surfaced in response to something. A shift in the college's underground environment. A change in what the sealed levels were doing, or holding, or emanating. Something moved deep under the ice, and the eye moved toward it the way a compass moves toward north. Not because anyone asked it to, but because the relationship between them made that movement natural outcome of the conditions that existed. The College of Winterhold maintains records on its own students and faculty. This is expected. An institution needs to know who is working within it, what they are researching, and what their standing within the organization is. The records that are expected are kept in expected places, accessible to appropriate levels of faculty, organized according to institutional need, updated as circumstances change. The records that are not expected are kept elsewhere. The college maintains a secondary documentation system that tracks magical practitioners operating in Skyrim who have no formal connection to the college. Independent mages, hedge practitioners, people with magical ability who have never enrolled, never applied, and never indicated any interest in the institution. This system is not publicly known. It is not described in any document the college makes available to students or to external institutions that request information about the college's practices. It is maintained by a small number of senior faculty who have been trusted with its existence, updated through a network of informal observation that operates through the college's connections across Skyrim without those connections knowing what information they are contributing to. Why does the college maintain this information? The official internal justification, preserved in the parallel documentation that archmages pass between themselves, describes it as a safety measure, a way of knowing what magical activity is, occurring in Skyrim that the college has no direct oversight of, so that situations that might develop into problems can be identified before they become actual problems. This justification is plausible. It is also, some fans note, a description that could apply equally to surveillance, conducted for institutional competitive reasons. keeping track of what independent practitioners are doing, what they are discovering, and whether any of it represents something the college should be aware of for its own research purposes. The two motivations are not mutually exclusive. The college's internal justification emphasizes one. The full picture, for those who know the system exists, probably includes both. The cliff the college stands on is not simply a geographic feature that happened to be available when someone decided to build a magical institution. The location was chosen. The choice was made by people who understood what they were selecting and why. The natural magicka concentration at that site, the quality that early Nordic mage circles would have recognized and sought out, the pull that draws magical energy toward that promontory above the sea, was the primary reason the college was built there, rather than somewhere more accessible, more politically comfortable, or more structurally sound. What this means is that the college's underground levels are not simply sealed rooms beneath a building. They are sealed rooms within a location that has been actively concentrating magicka for longer than the college has existed. Every century that passes, the deep levels accumulate more of what the site naturally draws. Every sealed object in those rooms exists within an environment that is not static, that is slowly, continuously becoming more charged with the specific quality of magical energy this particular piece of ground has always attracted. The college above it has been operating for centuries. The ground beneath it has been doing something much older and much less supervised for far longer. What eventually comes from that combination, what the deep levels eventually become, given enough time and enough accumulation, is not a question and the college's official documentation addresses. It is a question that each archmage receives with the keys and considers privately in the hours when the hall is quiet and the cliff outside is dark and the sea below it is doing what the sea has always done, wearing the rock away one wave at a time, patient and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with what is being preserved in the cold and the silence just above the waterline. Every organization has rules. The ones worth knowing are rarely the ones written down. The Thieves Guild operates on a code that new members receive in partial form, enough to function, enough to avoid the most obvious violations, enough to stay alive in the early period when mistakes are most likely and most costly. The rest of the code exists in a different form entirely. It lives in the behavior of experienced members in the specific way certain things are said and certain other things are never said. In the knowledge that passes between people who have been in the guild long enough to understand that the document they were handed when they joined was an introduction, not a complete account. The written code of the Thieves Guild covers the basics with reasonable clarity. Do not steal from other guild members. Do not kill unless the contract specifically requires it. Do not deal in slavery or other activities that would draw the kind of attention the guild cannot manage. Pay the guild's cut on all jobs conducted through its network. These rules are real and they are enforced. Violations carry consequences that the guild applies consistently enough that members take them seriously. Below this written layer sits something much larger. The unwritten rules of the Thieves Guild cover situations that the written code does not address, situations that arise from the specific character of what the guild is and how it operates, rather than from the general principles any organized criminal enterprise might need to manage. These rules exist nowhere in any document. They are transmitted verbally by experienced members to newer ones, selectively and in context. When a situation arises that the unwritten rule applies to, the relevant rule gets mentioned, not as a lecture, not as an official communication, as a quiet aside from someone who has been in the guild long enough to know what happens when the rule is not followed. Some of these rules are practical in obvious ways. Never use the same approach twice on the same target. Never fence through the same contact 2 jobs in a row during a period when you have reason to believe you are being watched. Never discuss the details of a completed job in any location that was connected to that job. Others are less obviously practical and more clearly cultural. Specific behaviors that mark someone as genuinely part of the guild, rather than simply working through it. The way certain information is requested. The specific formulation used when asking for something sensitive through guild channels. The things that are never said directly and are instead communicated through a vocabulary of indirection that takes time to fully acquire. The ragged flagon sits in the ratway beneath Riften, a city already built on layers of crime, political compromise, and commercial arrangements that the official economy does not acknowledge. The flagon is the guild's primary gathering point, its social center, its place of informal communication between members who might not otherwise interact. It is dim, it smells of old ale and damp stone, and it is one of the more comfortable places in Riften if your comfort depends on being somewhere that most people who might want to find you will not look. Before the guild made it their base, the ragged flagon was something else. The space it occupies was not designed for the purpose it currently serves. The architecture of the ratway, the passages, the chambers, the specific arrangement of the space that became the flagon, predates the guild's use of it by a significant margin. The stonework is older than the guild's tenure in Riften. The layout reflects a purpose different from a drinking establishment or a gathering point for an organized criminal network. Some fans believe the Ragged Flagon's location was originally a processing facility of some kind, a space designed for the movement and temporary storage of goods that needed to be kept out of sight during transit through Riften. The city's position on Lake Honrich made it a natural waypoint for goods moving between holds, and the ratway's connection to the lake created possibilities for the kind of invisible commerce that official markets could not accommodate. The guild did not build the infrastructure they use. They occupied infrastructure that had been built for similar purposes by people who preceded them in Riften's long history of below-surface commerce. The flagon's particular atmosphere, the feeling of a place that has been used for quiet and careful business for a very long time, is not an accident of the guild's tenure. It is a quality the space accumulated before the guild arrived, and that the guild simply continued. The Thieves Guild tracks debts. This is expected. Any organization that brokers arrangements between people who do not always deal honestly needs some system for maintaining accountability. What is less expected is the specific category of debt that the guild maintains records on, that cannot be collected through any mechanism available to the guild or to anyone else operating within normal social and legal frameworks. These are obligations incurred through arrangements that created genuine leverage, but that, for various reasons, cannot be called in through direct request or through any form of pressure that the debtor could not simply refuse. The debtor knows they owe something. The guild knows they are owed. Both parties understand that the standard mechanisms for collecting do not apply. The debt exists in a space where acknowledgement is shared, but resolution is structurally impossible. The guild keeps these records anyway. The ledger that tracks uncollectible debts is maintained with the same care given to the ledger that tracks ordinary guild business. Names, circumstances, the specific nature of what was provided and what was promised in return, the date the obligation was incurred, and the date it became clear that collection through direct means was not viable. Some entries in this ledger are very old, obligations incurred by people who are long dead, by institutions that have changed beyond recognition, by arrangements made in circumstances that no longer exist. Why maintain records of debts that cannot be collected? The practical answer is that circumstances change. A debt that is uncollectible today may become collectible when the situation around it shifts, when the person who owes it becomes vulnerable in a new way, or when the thing they were protecting by not paying becomes less important to them, or when someone connected to them inherits both the benefit of the original arrangement and the obligation attached to it. The guild keeps the records because patience is one of the skills that has kept it operational across a very long time. The uncollectible debts are not written off, they are filed. They wait. Maven Blackbriar is the most powerful private individual in Riften. She controls commercial networks that operate through and around the city's official economy, maintains relationships with political authorities in Riften and beyond, and has a documented connection to the Thieves Guild that most Riften residents are aware of in general terms without knowing its specific nature. The guild works with Maven. Maven benefits from the guild's capabilities. The arrangement has been stable for long enough that it functions like a feature of Riften's landscape, simply part of how the city works. What the guild's leadership knows and does not discuss is that the arrangement with Maven is not between equals. Maven holds something specific, information, documentation, or leverage of a kind that the guild cannot neutralize, that gives her a position in relation to the guild that reverses the normal power dynamic between an organization and an individual client. Most people who work with the guild do so from a position where the guild's capabilities give it the stronger hand. Maven works with the guild from a position where her specific leverage gives her a hand the guild cannot challenge without consequences it has decided are too significant to risk. The guild's leadership is aware of this. They have been aware of it for as long as Maven's relationship with the guild has existed in its current form. The decision not to address it, not to find and eliminate whatever leverage she holds, not to restructure the relationship on terms more favorable to the guild, is itself a considered choice. The cost of the current arrangement, whatever it is in practical terms, has been judged by guild leadership to be lower than the cost of the conflict that attempting to change it would produce. Maven is allowed to hold her position. The guild operates around it, and the knowledge of exactly what she holds and why the guild has chosen not to contest it stays at the leadership level, mentioned to successors as part of the context they need to understand the Riften operation, and never discussed more openly than that. The skeleton key was stolen from the Thieves Guild. This is the framing the guild uses internally, and the framing that players encounter in the game's questline. An artifact central to the guild's connection with Nocturnal was taken by a former member who used it for purposes that served his own interests, rather than the guild's. The guild's luck failed as a result. The questline involves recovering the key and returning it to the Twilight Sepulchre where it belongs. Some fans believe this framing is incomplete. The theory holds that the key's removal was not simply a theft, that Nocturnal, who has full awareness of everything connected to her pact with the guild, allowed the removal to happen, not because she was unable to prevent it, because she wanted to see what the guild would do without it. In this reading, the period of bad luck the guild experienced after the key's theft was not an unintended consequence of the artifact's removal. It was a condition Nocturnal created deliberately, a test of whether the guild would recognize what it had lost, understand why it had lost it, and take the actions necessary to restore the arrangement. The theft provided the mechanism. The test was whether the guild, stripped of the luck it had operated on for so long, could function well enough to trace the problem to its source and fix it. The guild in this reading barely passed. The organization had deteriorated significantly by the time the events of Skyrim's main questline occur. Membership down, operations compromised, leadership weakened by the Mercer Frey situation that had been developing alongside the key's absence. Nocturnal received her key back. The channel to her realm was restored, but the guild that restored it was not the same organization it had been before the test began. Whether Nocturnal considers what the guild demonstrated during that period satisfactory, whether the arrangement continues on the same terms, or whether something in the relationship quietly shifted during those years of failure, is not something the guild's current leadership has been told. Nocturnal does not explain her arrangements. She simply continues them until one supposes she decides not to. Step back far enough from any single thing and patterns appear that you cannot see from close up. The Companions, the Dark Brotherhood, the Thieves Guild, the College of Winterhold, the Morag Tong. Each of them has its own history, its own founding, its own specific character built across centuries of operation. But step back far enough and something else comes into view. Something that connects all of them. A shape they all share without any of them having designed it. A pattern that runs through every guild in Skyrim like a thread woven through cloth. Visible only when you know what you are looking for, and very quiet once you find it. The Companions serve her scene, not by intention, not by theology, not by any conscious devotion directed at him. They serve him through the arrangement their founders made, through the beast blood that arrangement introduced into the organization, and through the soul claim that blood carries forward to every member who receives it. The Companions think of themselves as independent. They have no patron deity. They answer to no external authority. This self-understanding is genuine, and it coexists, without the Companions being aware of the coexistence, with the fact that her scene holds a real and ongoing claim on what happens to their souls after death. The Dark Brotherhood serves Sithis. This is explicit, intentional, and central to everything the Brotherhood is. The Brotherhood knows it serves Sithis. It was built to serve him. The devotion is not incidental. It is the entire point. And yet, as the oldest Brotherhood texts suggest, and as the theory around Sithis's nature implies, what the Brotherhood actually serves may not be what it believes it serves. The personified Sithis of Brotherhood theology may be a construction built around something that has no personality, no preferences, and no capacity to receive the devotion directed at it. The Brotherhood serves its idea of Sithis with genuine commitment. Whether that commitment reaches anything on the other end is a question the theology answers confidently, and the cosmology leaves genuinely open. The Thieves Guild serves Nocturnal, knowingly through the Nightingale Pact, and unknowingly through the broader guild membership that benefits from the arrangement without being party to it. The college serves no Daedric prince explicitly, but the location it was built on, the quality of the underground space beneath it, and the patterns in what it studies and what it keeps sealed suggest a connection to something that preceded the institution, something the location carried before the college arrived, and that the college has been building on and feeding ever since. And the Morag Tong, oldest of them all, began as Mephala's organization and retained her organizational principles long after the explicit theological connection faded. Not one of them serves a divine. The 9 divines, the gods of the imperial religion, the deities that most of Tamriel's mortal population orients its formal spiritual life around, have no guild. No organized institution of any significant age or durability has been built around them that has survived into the 4th era in any form comparable to what the Daedric adjacent guilds have maintained. This is a pattern that runs through Tamriel's institutional history too consistently to be coincidence. The organizations that last are the ones connected, directly or indirectly, to Daedric principles. The ones built around divine worship have tended to rise within political structures and fall when those structures changed. What the Daedric connections provide, the soul claims, the organizational principles, the specific kind of durability that comes from being tied to something that does not live in time, keeps institutions running across spans of history that purely mortal organizations cannot match. Guild leaders die alone with things they know. This pattern repeats across every organization in Skyrim's history, with a consistency that becomes visible only when you stop looking at individual leaders and look at the shape of the role itself. Kodlak Whitemane carried knowledge about Hircine's claim that he held privately for years. He researched alone. He knew things the Circle did not know. He died before completing what he had been working on, and what he had not finished had to be completed by others who were working from incomplete information about what he had already understood. Galerion the Mystic maintained a private archive throughout his life that contained things the guild he founded was never told. What happened to that archive after his death is unknown. The knowledge in it, whatever it was, did not pass into the institutional record in any recoverable form. The archmages of the college receive the keys to sealed spaces that they then carry alone, adding their own private observations to a record that only their successors in that specific position will ever see. The Black Hand's listener accumulates something through prolonged contact with the Night Mother that other Brotherhood members do not share. A weight, an attenuation, a specific kind of knowledge about the void that the role produces, and that has no mechanism for transmission to anyone who has not occupied the role themselves. The pattern is this. The position at the top of every significant guild in Skyrim is a position of isolation, not the ordinary isolation of leadership, the separation from peers that any position of authority produces. Something more specific. These leaders hold knowledge that the organization needs them to hold, but cannot be structured to hold collectively. The knowledge is too sensitive, or too heavy, or too connected to things the organization's broader membership is not equipped to deal with. So it concentrates at the top, and when the person at the top dies, some of it passes forward and some of it does not. The part that does not pass forward disappears, and the organization continues, slightly diminished in its self-knowledge, carrying less of its own history than it did before. Between the Companion's wolf blood, the Nightingale's shadow oath, and the Brotherhood's death vow, a parallel runs that none of these organizations has ever formally acknowledged, because none of them has ever had reason to compare notes with the others. And the comparison reveals something that each individual organization, encountering it alone, has simply treated as a feature of their own specific arrangement rather than as part of a broader pattern. All three bind the soul after death. The beast blood directs the companion's souls to Hircine's hunting grounds. The Nightingale oath directs those who take it to the Twilight Sepulchre in service to Nocturnal. The Brotherhood's devotion to Sithis directs souls offered through their work. And, some fans believe, souls of Brotherhood members themselves toward the void. 3 different organizations, 3 different Daedric connections, 3 different mechanisms, 1 outcome. Membership in these organizations has consequences for what happens to you after you stop being alive that ordinary membership in ordinary organizations does not carry. This is not presented anywhere in Skyrim as a coordinated system. The 3 guilds did not design this collectively. They each arrived at their arrangements separately, through their own histories, for their own reasons. The parallel is not the result of planning. It is the result of the specific kind of durability that Daedric connections provide, and the cost that durability carries, paid not during life, but after it. What the 3 guilds collectively represent, seen from the distance of this final chapter, is a set of arrangements where the price of belonging is deferred. You pay during your life in smaller ways. The beast blood's mental adjustments, the Nightingale armor's slow reorientation, the Brotherhood's psychological cost of sustained void contact. The larger payment comes due after the life is over, and by then, of course, there is nothing left to renegotiate. Skyrim's official history is a record of what the people who wrote it chose to preserve. Rulers and battles and religious movements, and the rise and fall of political structures. It is not a complete account of what happened. No written history ever is. What the written record consistently omits is the internal history of the organizations that operated below the level of political visibility. The things the companions decided not to record. The things the Brotherhood was constitutionally unable to document. The things the college sealed rather than filed. The things the Thieves Guild transmitted verbally rather than committing to any form that could be found and read. These organizations collectively hold a version of Skyrim's history that the official record does not contain, not in any place that can be accessed easily, not in any document or archive or sealed room that a determined researcher could simply locate and open. It is held in the cultures of the organizations themselves, in the behaviors that persist past their original reasons, in the specific ways senior members of each guild handle certain kinds of situations, ways that trace back to decisions made in circumstances that current members have no knowledge of. The guild is the archive. The people who belong to it are the storage medium, and the information held this way does not have an index or a retrieval mechanism. It simply continues, embedded in how the organization operates, until the organization itself ends and takes what it was carrying with it into whatever silence follows. Tamriel keeps turning. The errors move through their long sequence. The dawn gives way to the Merethic. The Merethic gives way to the numbered errors of recorded history. Civilizations rise and fall, and leave their ruins in the ground for later peoples to walk over without fully understanding what they are standing on. The dragons ruled, then slept, then returned. The empires expanded, consolidated, and came apart. The names that seemed permanent became the names that required explanation, and eventually became the names that required research, and eventually became the names that nobody remembered without being told. Through all of it, the guilds kept running, not unchanged, not without difficulty, not without periods of decline and near collapse and recovery, but running. The companions existed before the First Era's kingdoms and still exist in the Fourth Era's civil war. The organizations connected to Nocturnal and Mephala and Hircine and Sithis have all maintained continuity across spans of history that have consumed and replaced everything else around them. The pattern this represents is not one of strength in the conventional sense. It is not the strength of armies, or the strength of political authority, or the strength of popular devotion. It is the strength of a secret, kept long enough to become part of the structure of things, invisible, load-bearing, no longer requiring active maintenance, because it has been internalized so deeply by the people who carry it that they carry it without knowing they are carrying anything at all. Every guild in Skyrim is a place where the past is still present in a form that the people inside it can no longer fully read. Every secret they hold has a sleeping edge, a quality of not yet having fully arrived at whatever it is eventually going to mean. The guilds are patient in the way that only things connected to Daedric time can be patient. They do not rush toward their purposes. They simply continue, and somewhere in that long, slow continuing, in the old stone of Jovaska, and the sealed levels below the college, and the Ragflagon, and the dark corridors of whatever sanctuary the Brotherhood is, currently calling home, all the things that have not yet been found are still there, resting, quiet, waiting with the particular patience of something that has already outlasted everything that was ever supposed to outlast it.